Section 15 of John Brown by W.E.B. Du Bois. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. The Great Black Way, Part 2. Then he went east to see his family and visit Douglas, where he met and persuaded Shields Green, and to consult with Gerrit Smith and Sanborn. Alcott at Concord wrote, "This evening I heard Captain Brown speak at the town hall on Kansas affairs, and the part took by them in the late troubles there. He tells his story with surpassing simplicity and sense, impressing us all deeply by his courage and religious earnestness. Our best people listen to his words, Emerson, Thoreau, Judge Hoar, my wife, and some of them contribute something in aid of his plans without asking particulars. Such confidence does he inspire in his integrity and abilities. I have a few words with him after his speech, and find him superior to legal traditions, and a disciple of the right in ideality and the affairs of the state. He is Sanborn's guest, and stays for a day only. A young man named Anderson accompanies him. They go armed, I am told, and will defend themselves if necessary. I believe they are now on their way to Connecticut and farther south, but the captain leaves us much in the dark concerning his destination and designs for the coming months. Yet he does not conceal his hatred of slavery, nor his readiness to strike a blow for freedom at the proper moment. I infer he intends to run off as many slaves as he can, and so render that property insecure to the master. I think him equal to anything he dares, the man to do the deed if it must be done, and with the martyr's temper and purpose. Nature was deeply intent in the making of him. He is of imposing appearance personally, tall, with square shoulders and standing, eyes of deep gray, and couchant, as if ready to spring at the least rustling. Dauntless yet kindly, his hair shooting backward from low down on his forehead, nose trenchant and Romanesque, set lips, his voice suppressed yet metallic, suggesting deep reserves, decided mouth, the countenance and frame charged with power throughout. Since here last he has added a flowing beard, which gives the soldierly air and the port of an apostle. Though 60 years old, he is agile and alert and ready for any audacity in any crisis. I think him about the manliest man I have ever seen, the type and synonym of the just." The month of May John Brown spent in Boston collecting funds, and in New York consulting his Negro friends, with a trip to Connecticut to hurry the making of his 1,000 pikes. Sickness intervened, but at last on June 20th the advance guard of 5, Brown and 2 of his sons, Jerry Anderson and Coggy, started southward. They stayed several days at Chambersburg, where Coggy, cooperating with a faithful Negro barber, Watson, was established as a general agent to forward men, mail, and freight. Then passing through Hagerstown, they appeared at Harper's Ferry on July 4th. Here they met Cook, who had been selling maps, keeping the canal lock near the arsenal, and sending regular information to Brown. Brown and his sons wandered about at first, and a local farmer greeted them cheerily. "Good morning, gentlemen, how do you do?" They returned the greeting pleasantly. The conversation is recounted as follows. I said, "Well, gentlemen," after saluting them in that form, "I suppose you are out hunting minerals, gold and silver?" His answer was, "No, we are not, but we are out looking for land. We want to buy land. We have a little money, but we want to make it go as far as we can." He asked me about the price of the land. I told him that it ranged from $15 to $30 in the neighborhood. He remarked, "That is high. I thought I could buy land here for about $1 or $2 per acre." I remarked to him, "No, sir. If you expect to get land for that price, you will have to go further west, to Kansas or some of those territories, where there is government land." I then asked him where they came from. His answer was, "From the northern part of the state of New York." I asked him what he followed there. He said farming, and the frost had been so heavy lately that it cut off their crops there, that he could not make anything and sold out, and thought he would come further south and try it a while. Through this easy-going, inquisitive farmer, Brown learned of a farm for rent, which he hired for 9 months for $35. It was on the main road between Harper's Ferry, Chambersburg, and the north, about 5 miles from the ferry, and in a quiet, secluded place. The house stood about 300 yards back from the Boonesboro Pike, in plain sight. About 600 yards away, on the other side of the road, was another cabin of 1 room and a garret, which was largely hidden from view by the shrubbery. Here Brown settled and gradually collected his men and material. The arms were especially slow in coming. Most of the guns arrived at Chambersburg from Connecticut about August, but the pikes did not come until a month later. Then, too, the men were gathered slowly. They were at the 4 ends of the country in all sorts of employment and different financial conditions, and they were not certain just when the raid would take place. All this delayed Brown from July until October, and greatly increased the cost of maintenance. A daughter, Anne, and Oliver's girl wife came and kept the house from July 16th to October 1st. At this critical juncture, Harriet Tubman fell sick, a grave loss to the cause, and there were other delays. By August 1st there were at Harper's Ferry the 2 Brown daughters and 3 sons, and the 2 brothers of a son-in-law, besides the 2 Coppocks, Tidd, Jerry Anderson, and Stevens. Hazlitt, Lehman, and Taylor came soon after. Coggy was still at Chambersburg, and John Brown himself labored and traveled night and day, sometimes on old Dolly, his brown mule, and sometimes in the wagon. He would start directly after night and travel the 50 miles between the farm and Chambersburg by daylight the next morning, and he otherwise kept open communication between headquarters and the latter place, in order that matters might be arranged in due season. In the North, John Brown, Jr. was shipping the arms and gathering men and money. He was in Boston August 10th at Douglas's home, soon after, and later in Canada with Loguen. All the chief branches of the League were visited, and then northern Ohio. The result was meager, not because of a lack of men, but a lack of the kind of men wanted at this time. There were thousands of Negroes ready to fight for liberty in the ranks, but most of these John Brown could not use at present. No considerable band of armed black men could have been introduced into the South without immediate discovery and civil war. It was therefore picked leaders like Douglas, Reynolds, Holden, and Delaney that Brown wanted at first. Discreet and careful men of influence, who, as he said to Douglas, could hive the swarming bees both north and south. To get these picked men interested was, however, difficult. Each had his work and his theory of racial salvation. They were widely scattered. A number of them had been convinced in 1858, but the postponement had given time for reflection and doubt. In many ways, the original enthusiasm had waned, but it was not dead. The cause was just as great, and all that was needed was to convince men that this was a real chance to strike an effective blow. They required the magic of Brown's own presence to impress this fact upon them. They were not sure of his agents. Men continued to come, however, others began to prepare, and still others were almost persuaded. An urgent summons went to Kansas to white fellow workers, and the response there was similarly small. Brown knew that his ability to command the services of a large number of Northern Negroes depended to some degree on Frederick Douglass's attitude. He was the first great national Negro leader, a man of ability, finesse, and courage. If he followed John Brown, who could hesitate? If he refused, was it not for the best of reasons? Thus John Brown continually urged Douglas, and as a last appeal arranged for a final conference on August 19th at Chambersburg, in an abandoned stone quarry. Douglas says, "As I came near, he regarded me rather suspiciously, but soon recognized me and received me cordially. He had in his hand, when I met him, a fishing tackle, with which he had been fishing in a stream hard by. But I saw no fish, and did not suppose he cared much for his fisherman's luck. The fishing was simply a disguise, and was certainly a good one. He looked every way like a man of the neighborhood, and as much at home as any of the farmers around there. His hat was old and storm-beaten, and his clothing was about the color of the stone quarry itself, his then present dwelling place. His face wore an anxious expression, and he was much worn by thought and exposure. I felt that I was on a dangerous mission, and was as little desirous of discovery as himself, though no reward had been offered for me. We, Mr. Coggy, Captain Brown, Shields Green, and myself, sat down among the rocks, and talked over the enterprise which was about to be undertaken. The taking of Harper's Ferry, of which Captain Brown had merely hinted before, was now declared as his settled purpose, and he wanted to know what I thought of it. I at once opposed the measure with all the arguments at my command. To me, such a measure would be fatal to running off slaves, as was the original plan, and fatal to all engaged in doing so. It would be an attack upon the federal government, and would array the whole country against us. Captain Brown did most of the talking on the other side of the question. He did not at all object to rousing the nation. It seemed to him that something startling was just what the nation needed. Our talk was long and earnest. We spent most of Saturday and a part of Sunday in this debate. Brown for Harper's Ferry, and I against it. He for striking a blow which should instantly rouse the country, and I for the policy of gradually and unaccountably drawing off the slaves to the mountains, as at first suggested and proposed by him. When I found that he had fully made up his mind and could not be dissuaded, I turned to Shields Green, and told him he heard what Captain Brown had said, his old plan was changed, and that I should return home, and if he wished to go with me, he could do so. Captain Brown urged us both to go with him, but I could not do so, and could but feel that he was about to rivet the fetters more firmly than ever on the limbs of the enslaved. In parting, he put his arms around me in a manner more than friendly, and said, "Come with me, Douglas. I will defend you with my life. I want you for a special purpose. When I strike, the bees will begin to swarm, and I shall want you to help hive them." But my discretion, or my cowardice, made me proof against the dear old man's eloquence. Perhaps it was something of both that determined my course. When about to leave, I asked Green what he had decided to do, and was surprised by his coolly saying, in his broken way, "I believe I'll go with the old man." Here we separated, they to go to Harper's Ferry, I to Rochester. Douglas's decision undoubtedly kept many negroes from joining Brown. Shields Green, however, started south. The slave catchers followed him and made him and Owen Brown swim a river. Only their journeying southward instead of northward saved them from capture. Life at the farm during this time was curious. Anderson says, "There was no milk and water sentimentality, no offensive contempt for the Negro while working in his cause. The pulsations of every heart beat in harmony for the suffering and pleading slave. I thank God that I have been permitted to realize, to its furthest, fullest extent, the moral, mental, physical, social harmony of an anti-slavery family, carrying out to the letter the principles of its antitype, the anti-slavery cause. In John Brown's house, and in John Brown's presence, men from widely different parts of the continent met and united into one company, wherein no hateful prejudice dared intrude its ugly self. No ghost of distinction found space to enter. To a passer-by, the house and its surroundings presented but indifferent attractions. Any log tenement of equal dimensions would be as likely to arrest a stray glance. Rough, unsightly, and aged, it was only for those privileged to enter and tarry for a long time, and to penetrate the mysteries of the 2 rooms it contained, kitchen, parlor, dining room below, and the spacious chamber, attic, storeroom, prison, drilling room, comprised in the loft above, could tell how we lived at Kennedy Farm. Every morning, when the noble old man was at home, he called the family around, read from his Bible, and offered to God most fervent and touching supplications for all flesh, and especially pathetic were his petitions in behalf of the oppressed. I never heard John Brown pray that he did not make strong appeals to God for the deliverance of the slave. This duty over, the men went to the loft, there to remain all day long. few only could be seen about, as the neighbors were watchful and suspicious. It was also important to talk but little among ourselves, as visitors to the house might be curious. Besides the daughter and daughter-in-law who superintended the work, some one or other of the men was regularly detailed to assist in the cooking, washing, and other domestic work. After the ladies left, we did all the work, no one being exempt because of age or official grade in the organization. The principal employment of the prisoners, as we severally were when compelled to stay in the loft, was to study Forbes's manual and to go through a quiet, though rigid, drill, under the training of Captain Stevens at some times. At other times we applied a preparation for bronzing our gun barrels, discussed subjects of reform, related our personal history. But when our resources became pretty well exhausted, the ennui from confinement, imposed silence, etc., would make the men almost desperate. At such times, neither slavery nor slaveholders were discussed mincingly. We were, while the ladies remained, often relieved of much of the dullness growing out of restraint by their kindness. As we could not circulate freely, they would bring in wild fruit and flowers from the woods and fields. Anne, the young daughter, says, "One day, a short time after I went down there, father was sitting at the table, writing. I was nearby sewing, he and I being alone in the room, when two little wrens that had a nest under the porch came flying in at the door, fluttering and twittering. Then they flew back to their nest and again to us several times, seemingly trying to attract our attention. They appeared to be in great distress. I asked father what he thought was the matter with the little birds. He asked if I had ever seen them act so before. I told him no. Then let us go and see, he said. We went out and found that a snake had crawled up the post and was just ready to devour the little ones in the nest. Father killed the snake, and the old birds sat on the railing and sang as if they would burst. It seemed as if they were trying to express their joy and gratitude to him for saving their little ones. After we went back into the room, he said he thought it strange the way the birds asked him to help them, and asked if I thought it an omen of his success. He seemed very much impressed with that idea. I do not think he was superstitious, but you know he always thought and felt that God called him to that work, and seemed to place himself, or rather to imagine himself, in position of the figure in the old seal of Virginia, with the tyrant under her foot. The men discussed religion and slavery freely, read Paine's Age of Reason and the Baltimore Sun. John Brown himself was careful to cultivate the goodwill of his neighbors, attending with skill the sick among the animals and men, so much so that he and his sons became prime favorites. Owen had long conversations with the people, while Cook was also moving about the country, selling maps. A little Dunker chapel was near, with non-resistant, anti-slavery principles. Here John Brown often worshipped and preached. Yet with all this caution and care, suspicion lurked about them, and discovery was always imminent. Brown's daughter relates that there was a family of poor people who lived nearby and who had rented the garden on the Kennedy place, directly back of the house. The little barefooted woman and 4 small children, she carried the youngest in her arms, would all come trooping over to the garden at all hours of the day, and at times, several times during the day. Nearly always they would come up the steps and into the house and stay a short time. This made it very troublesome for us, compelling the men, when she came in sight at meal times, to gather up the victuals and tablecloth and quietly disappear upstairs. One Saturday, father and I went to a religious Dunker meeting that was held in a grove near the schoolhouse, and the folks left at home forgot to keep a sharp lookout for Mrs. Hyfemaster, and she stole into the house before they saw her, and saw Shields Green. That must have been in September. Barclay Coppet and Will Lemnian. And another time after that, she saw C.P. Tidd standing on the porch. She thought these strangers were running off Negroes to the north. I used to give her everything she wanted or asked for to keep her on good terms, but we were in constant fear that she was either a spy or would betray us. It was like standing on a powder magazine after a slow match had been lighted. Despite all precautions, a rumor began to get into the air. A Prussian Pole was among the Kansas cooperators invited. He had been in Kansas in 1856 and was known to Brown and Kagi. After hearing from Brown in August 1859, the Pole disclosed their plans to Edmund Babb, a correspondent of the Cincinnati Gazette. It was probably Babb who thereupon wrote to the United States Secretary of War, "I have discovered the existence of a secret association, having for its object the liberation of the slaves at the South and by a general insurrection. The leader of the movement is one Old John Brown, late of Kansas." Approximately correct details of the plot followed, but Secretary Floyd was lolling at a summer resort and had some little conspiracies of his own in hand, not unconnected with United States arsenals. Being, therefore, as he said magniloquently, satisfied in my mind that a scheme of such wickedness and outrage could not be entertained by any citizens of the United States, I put the letter away and thought no more of it until the raid broke out. Gerrit Smith, too, with little discretion, addressed to Negro audience words which plainly showed he shortly expected a slave insurrection. Even among Harper's Ferry party, forced inaction led to disputes and disaffection. John Brown sharply rebuked the letter writing and gossiping about his men. "Any person is a stupid fool," he told Kagi, "who expects his friends to keep for him that which he cannot keep himself. All our friends have each got their special friends, and they again have theirs, and it would not be right to lay the burden of keeping a secret on any one at the end of a long string. I could tell you of reasons I have for feeling rather keenly on this point." The men, on the other hand, were dissatisfied with Brown's plans as they were finally disclosed. Anne Brown writes that they generally did not know that the raid on the government works was a part of the plan until after they arrived at the farm in the beginning of August. They wanted simply to repeat the Missouri raid on a larger scale, and not try to capture the arsenal. Tidd was especially stubborn and irreconcilable. The discussion became so warm that John Brown at one time resigned. But he was immediately reelected, and this formal letter was sent to him. "Dear Sir, we have all agreed to sustain your decisions until you have proved incompetent, and many of us will adhere to your decisions so long as you will." In these ways Brown was compelled to hurry, and accordingly he urged his eldest son, who replied, "Through those associations which I formed in Canada, I am able to reach each individual member at the shortest notice by letter. I am devoting my whole time to our company business. I shall immediately go out organizing and raising funds. From what I even had understood, I had supposed you would not think it best to commence opening the coal banks before spring, unless circumstances should make it imperative. However, I suppose the reasons are satisfactory to you, and if so, those who own smaller shares ought not to object. I hope we shall be able to get off in season some of those old miners of whom I wrote you. I shall strain every nerve to accomplish this. You may be assured that what you say to me will reach those who may be benefited thereby, and those who would take stock in the shortest possible time, so don't fail to keep me posted." As late as October 6th, Brown expected to move about the end of the month, and made a hurried trip to Philadelphia. There he met a large group of Negroes, and Dorsey, the caterer with whom he stayed, at 1221 Locust Street, is said to have given him $300. In some way he was disappointed with the visit. Anderson says he went on the business of great importance. How important, men there and elsewhere now know. How affected by and affecting the main features of the enterprise, we at the farm knew full after their return, as the old captain, in the fullness of his overflowing, saddened heart, detailed point after point of interest. Perhaps he was still trying to persuade Douglas and the leaders of the Philadelphia and New York groups. The women left the farm late in September, and O.P. Anderson, Copeland, and Leary arrived. Miriam joined Brown while he was on the Philadelphia trip, and was sent to Baltimore to buy caps for the guns. Others were coming when suddenly Brown fixed on October 17th as the date of the raid. This hurried change was probably because officials and neighbors were getting inquisitive, and arms were being removed from the arsenal to man southern stations. Yet it was unfortunate, as Anderson says. Could other parties waiting for the word have reached the headquarters in time for the outbreak when it took place, the taking of the armory, engine house, the rifle factory would have been quite different. But the men at the farm had been so closely confined that they went out about the house and farm in the daytime during that week, and so indiscreetly exposed their numbers to the prying neighbors, who thereupon took steps to have a search instituted in the early part of the coming week. Captain Brown was not seconded in another quarter, as he expected, at the time of the action, but could the fears of the neighbors have been allayed for a few days, the disappointment in the former respect would not have been of much weight. Only the nearest of the slaves round about who awaited the word could be communicated with, and several recruits like Hinton were left stranded on the way, unable to get through in time. So the great day dawned. On Sunday morning, October 16th, Captain Brown arose earlier than usual and called his men down to worship. He read a chapter from the Bible applicable to the condition of the slaves and our duty as their brethren, and then offered up a fervent prayer to God to assist in the liberation of the bondmen in that slave-holding land. The services were impressive. A council was held, over which O.P. Anderson, the colored man, presided. In the afternoon the final orders were given, and at night, just before setting out, John Brown said, "And now, gentlemen, let me impress this one thing upon your minds. You all know how dear life is to you, and how dear life is to your friends. And in remembering that, consider that the lives of others are as dear to them as yours are to you. Do not, therefore, take the life of anyone if you can possibly avoid it. But if it is necessary to take life to save your own, then make sure work of it." End of section 15. Section 16 of John Brown by W.E.B. Du Bois. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Blow. Part 1. Woe unto them that call evil good, and good evil. At 8 o'clock on Sunday evening, Captain Brown said, "Men, get on your arms, we will proceed to the ferry." His horse and wagon were brought out before the door, and some pikes, a sledge-hammer, and a crowbar were placed in it. The captain then put on his old Kansas cap and said, "Come, boys," when we marched out of the camp behind him into the lane leading down the hill to the main road. The orders given commanded Owen Brown, Merriam, and Barclay Coppock to watch the house and arms until ordered to bring them toward the ferry. Tidd and Cook were to cut the telegraph lines, and Coggy and Stevens to detain the bridge guard. Watson Brown and Taylor were to hold the bridge over the Potomac, and Oliver Brown and William Thompson the bridge over the Shenandoah. Jerry Anderson and Dauphin Thompson were to occupy the engine house in the arsenal yard, while Hazlitt and Edwin Coppock were to hold the armory. During the night, Coggy and Copeland were to seize and guard the rifle factory, and others were to go out in the country and bring in certain masters and their slaves. It was a cold, dark night when the band started. Ahead was John Brown in his one-horse farm wagon, with pikes, a sledge-hammer, and a crowbar. Behind him marched the men, silently and at intervals, Cook and Tidd leading. They had 5 miles to go, over rolling hills and through woods, and then down to a narrow road between the cliffs and the Cincinnati and Ohio Canal. As they approached the railroad, Cook and Tidd cut the telegraph wires which led to Baltimore and Washington. At the bridge they halted and made ready their arms. At 10 o'clock, William Williams, one of the watchmen there, was surprised to find himself a prisoner in the hands of Coggy and Stevens, who took him through the covered structure to the town, leaving Watson Brown and Stewart Taylor to guard the bridge. The rest of the company entered Harper's Ferry. The land between the rivers is itself high, though dwarfed by the mountains and running down to a low point where the rivers join. At this place the bridge leads to Maryland. After crossing the bridge to Virginia, about 60 yards up the street, running parallel to the Potomac, was the gate of the armory where the arms were made. On the Shenandoah side, about 60 yards from the armory gate, is the arsenal where the arms were stored. The company proceeded to the armory gate. The watchman tells how the place was captured. "Open the gate," said they. I said I could not if I was stuck, and one of them jumped up on the pier of the gate over my head, and another fellow ran and put his hand on me and caught me by the coat and held me. I was inside and they were outside, and the fellow standing over my head upon the pier. And then, when I would not open the gate for them, 5 or 6 ran in from the wagon, clapped their guns against my breast, and told me I should deliver up the key. I told them I could not, and another fellow made an answer and said they had not time now to be waiting for the key, but to go to the wagon and bring out the crowbar and large hammer, and they would soon get in. They went to the little wagon and brought a large crowbar out of it. There was a large chain around the 2 sides of the wagon gate going in. They twisted the crowbar in the chain, and they opened it, and in they ran and got in the wagon. One fellow took me. They all gathered about me and looked in my face. I was nearly scared to death with so many guns about me. The 2 captured watchmen, Anderson says, were left in the custody of Jerry Anderson and Dauphin Thompson, and A.D. Stevens arranged the men to take possession of the armory and rifle factory. About this time there was apparently much excitement. People were passing back and forth in the town, and before we could do much we had to take several prisoners. After the prisoners were secured, we passed to the opposite side of the street and took the armory, and Albert Hazlitt and Edwin Coppock were ordered to hold it for the time being. The other 14 men quickly dispersed through the village. Oliver Brown and William Thompson seized and guarded the bridge across the Shenandoah. This bridge was 60 rods from the highway bridge up the river, and was the direct route to Loudon Heights, the slave-filled lower valley, and the Great Black Way. It was, however, not the only way across the Shenandoah. A little more than half a mile farther up were the rifle works, where the stream could be easily forded. Kagi and Copeland went there, captured the watchmen, and took possession. These places were all taken and the prisoners secured without the snap of a gun or any violence whatever, says Anderson, and he continues, the town being taken, Brown, Stevens, and the men who had no post in charge returned to the engine house, where council was held, after which Captain Stevens, Tidd, Cook, Shields Green, Leary, and myself went to the country. On the road we met some colored men, to whom we made known our purpose, when they immediately agreed to join us. They said they had been long waiting for an opportunity of the kind. Stevens then asked them to go around among the colored people and circulate the news, when each started off in a different direction. The result was that many colored men gathered to the scene of action. The first prisoner taken by us was Colonel Lewis Washington, a relative of George Washington. When we neared his house, Captain Stevens placed Leary and Shields Green to guard the approaches to the house, the one at the side, the other in front. We then knocked. But no one answering, although females were looking from upper windows, we entered the building and commenced a search for the proprietor. Colonel Washington opened his room door and begged us not to kill him. Captain Stevens replied, "You are our prisoner," when he stood as if speechless or petrified. Stevens further told him to get ready to go to the ferry, that he had come to abolish slavery, not to take life but in self-defense, but that he must go along. The colonel replied, "You can have my slaves if you will let me remain." "No," said the captain, "you must go along too, so get ready." He and his male slaves were thus taken, together with a large 4-horse wagon and some arms, including the Lafayette sword. Away the party went, and after capturing another planter and his slaves, arrived at the ferry before daybreak. Meantime the citizens of the ferry, returning late from protracted Methodist meeting, were being taken prisoners, and about 1 o'clock in the morning the eastbound Baltimore and Ohio train arrived. This was detained, and the local colored porter shot dead by Brown's guards on the bridge. The passengers were greatly excited, but at first thought it was a strike of some kind. After sunrise, the train was allowed to proceed, John Brown himself walking ahead across the bridge to reassure the conductor. So Monday, October 17th, began, and Anderson says it was a time of stirring and exciting events. In consequence of the movements of the night before, we were prepared for commotion and tumult, but certainly not for more than we beheld around us. Gray dawn and yet brighter daylight revealed great confusion, and as the sun arose, the panic spread like wildfire. Men, women, and children could be seen leaving their homes in every direction, some seeking refuge among residents and in quarters further away, others climbing up the hillsides and hurrying off in various directions, evidently impelled by a sudden fear, which was plainly visible in their countenances or in their movements. Captain Brown was all activity, though I could not help thinking that at times he appeared somewhat puzzled. He ordered Louis Sherard Leary and 4 slaves, and a freeman belonging in the neighborhood, to join John Henry Coggy and John Copeland at the rifle factory, which they immediately did. After the departure of the train, quietness prevailed for a short time. A number of prisoners were already in the engine house, and of the many colored men living in the neighborhood who had assembled in the town, a number were armed. Up to this point, everything in John Brown's plan had worked like clockwork, and there had been but one death. The armory was captured, from 25 to 50 slaves had been armed, several masters were in custody, and the next move was to get the arms and ammunition from the farm. Cook says that when the party returned from the country at dawn, I stayed a short while in the engine house to get warm, as I was chilled through. After I got warm, Captain Brown ordered me to go with C.P. Tidd, who was to take William H. Leeman, and I think 4 slaves, Anderson says 14 slaves, with him in Colonel Washington's large wagon across the river, and to take Terence Burns and his brother and their slaves prisoners. My orders were to hold Burns and brother as prisoners at their own house, while Tidd and the slaves who accompanied him were to go to Captain Brown's house and to load in arms and bring them down to the schoolhouse, stopping for the Burnses and their guard. William H. Leeman remained with me to guard the prisoners. On return of the wagon, in compliance with orders, we all started for the schoolhouse. When we got there, I was to remain, by Captain Brown's orders, with one of the slaves, to guard the arms, while C.P. Tidd, with the other negroes, was to go back for the rest of the arms, and Burns was to be sent with William H. Leeman to Captain Brown at the armory. It was at this time that William Thompson came up from the ferry and reported that everything was all right, and then hurried to overtake William H. Leeman. A short time after the departure of Tidd, I heard a great deal of firing and became anxious to know the cause, but my orders were strict to remain in the schoolhouse and guard the arms, and I obeyed the orders to the letter. About 4 o'clock in the evening, C.P. Tidd came with the second load. Here, in all probability, was the fatal hitch. The farm was not over 3 miles from the schoolhouse, and there was a heavy farm wagon with 4 large strong horses and a dozen men or more to help. The fact that it took these men 11 hours to move 2 wagon loads of material less than 3 miles is the secret of the extraordinary failure of Brown's foray at a time when victory was in his grasp. That Cook was needlessly dilatory in the moving is certain. He sat down in Burns's house and made a speech on human equality. Then Tidd went on to the farm with the wagon and brought a load of arms, which he deposited at the point where the Kennedy Farm Road meets the Potomac almost at right angles, about 3 miles or less from the ferry. The schoolhouse stood here, and the children were frightened half to death. Cook stopped at this place and unloaded the wagon, and then Leeman went with Burns to the guardhouse, lingering and actually sitting beside the road. Even then they arrived before 10 o'clock. With haste, it is certain that, despite the muddy road, the first load of arms could have been at the schoolhouse before 8 o'clock in the morning, and the whole of the stores by 10 o'clock. That Brown expected this is shown by his sending William Thompson to reassure the men at the farm of his safety, and probably to urge haste. Yet When the second load of arms appeared, it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, at least 3 hours after Brown had been completely surrounded. Judging from Cook's narrative, it is likely that Thompson did not see Tidd at all. It was this inexcusable delay on the part of Tidd and Cook, and possibly William Thompson, that undoubtedly made the raid a failure. To be sure, John Brown never said so, never hinted that anyone was to blame but himself. But that was John Brown's way. Events in the town had moved quickly. After Cook had departed, Brown ordered O.P. Anderson to take the pikes out of the wagon in which he rode to the ferry, and to place them in the hands of the colored men who had come with us from the plantations, and others who had come forward without having had communication with any of our party. The citizens were wild with fright and excitement. The prisoners were also terror-stricken. Some wanted to go home to see their families, as if for the last time. The privilege was granted them, under escort, and they were brought back again. Edwin Coppock, one of the sentinels at the Armory gate, was fired at by one of the citizens, but the ball did not reach him, when one of the insurgents close by put up his rifle and made the enemy bite the dust. Among the arms taken from Colonel Washington was one double-barreled gun. This weapon was loaded by Lehman with buckshot, and placed in the hands of an elderly slave man, early in the morning. After the cowardly charge upon Coppock, this man was ordered by Captain Stevens to arrest a citizen. The old man ordered him to halt, which he refused to do, when instantly the terrible load was discharged into him, and he fell, and expired without a struggle. The next step which John Brown had in mind is unknown, but there were 2 safe movements at 9 a.m. Monday morning. A. The arms could have been brought across the Potomac Bridge and then across the Shenandoah, and so up Loudon Heights. The men from the Maryland side could have joined, and Brown and his men covered their retreat by compelling the hostages to march with them. Kagi and his men, by wading the Shenandoah, could have supported them. B. The arms could have been taken down to the Potomac from the schoolhouse, ferried across, and moved over to Kagi. Brown and his men could have joined the party there, and all retreated up Loudon Heights. From the fact that Brown had the arms stopped at the schoolhouse, this seems probably to have been the thought in his mind. On the other hand, the plan usually attributed to Brown is unthinkable, viz., that he intended retreating across the Potomac into the Maryland mountains. First, he had just come out of the Maryland mountains, and had moved down his arms and ammunition. And second, this maneuver would have cut his band off from the Great Black Way to the south, unless he captured the ferry a second time. Manifestly, this then was not Brown's idea. It has, however, been suggested that the arms had been moved down to the schoolhouse to be placed in the hands of slaves there. But why were they left on the Maryland side? In the whole Maryland county west of the mountains were less than 1,000 able-bodied Negroes, of whom not a tenth could have been cognizant of the uprising, while Brown had arms for 1,200 men or more. No, Brown intended to move the arms in bulk. He had perhaps a ton or a ton and a half of baggage. He wished it moved first to the schoolhouse, and then, if all was well, to the ferry, or straight across to the mountains. Cook started before 5 o'clock in the morning, and Brown no doubt expected to hear that the arms were at the schoolhouse by 10. At 11 o'clock he dispatched William Thompson to Kennedy Farm. Anderson thinks that Thompson's message made the farm party even more leisurely because it told of success so far. This is surely impossible. The veriest tyro must have known that minutes were golden, despite the tremendous fortune of the expedition. Did Thompson misapprehend his message? Was the delay Tidd's? And what was Owen Brown thinking and doing? It is a curious puzzle, but it is the puzzle of the foray. If the party with the arms had arrived at the bridge any time before noon, the raid would have been successful. Even as it was, Brown still had 3 courses open to him, all of which promised a measure of success. A. He could have gotten his band and crossed back to Maryland, although this meant the abandonment of the main features of his whole plan. As time waned, Stevens and Kagi urged this, but Brown refused. B. He could have gone to Loudon Heights, but this would have involved abandoning his arms and stores, and above all, one of his sons, Cook, Tidd, Merriam, Coppoc, and the slaves. This was unthinkable. C. He could have used his hostages to force terms. For not doing this he afterward repeatedly blamed himself, but characteristically blamed no one else for anything. Meantime, every minute of delay aroused the country and brought the citizens to their senses. The train that left Harper's Ferry carried a panic to Virginia, Maryland, and Washington with it. The passengers, taking all the paper they could find, wrote accounts of the insurrection, which they threw from the windows as the train rushed onward. A local physician says, "I went back to the hillside then, and tried to get the citizens together to see what we could do to get rid of these fellows. They seemed to be very troublesome. When I got on the hill, I learned that they had shot Bowerly. That was probably about 7 o'clock. I had ordered the Lutheran church bell to be rung to get the citizens together to see what sort of arms they had. I found 1 or 2 squirrel rifles and a few shotguns. I had sent a messenger to Charlestown in the meantime for Captain Rowan, commander of a volunteer company there. I also sent messengers to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad to stop the trains coming east, and not let them approach the ferry, and also a messenger to Shepherdstown." Another eyewitness adds, "There was unavoidable delay in the preparations for a fight because of the scarcity of weapons, for only a few squirrel guns and fowling pieces could be found. There were then at Harper's Ferry thousands and tens of thousands of muskets and rifles of the most approved patterns, but they were all boxed up in the arsenal, and the arsenal was in the hands of the enemy. And such, too, was the scarcity of the ammunition that, after using up the limited supply of lead found in the village stores, pewter plates and spoons had to be melted and molded into bullets for the occasion. By 9 o'clock a number of indifferently armed citizens assembled on Camp Hill and decided that the party, consisting of half a dozen men, should cross the Potomac a short distance above the ferry, and, going down the towpath of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal as far as the railway bridge, should attack the 2 sentinels stationed there, who, by the way, had been reinforced by 4 more of Brown's party. Another small party under Captain Medler was to cross the Shenandoah and take the position opposite the rifle works, while Captain Avis, with a sufficient force, should take possession of the Shenandoah Bridge, and Captain Roderick, with some of the armorers, should post themselves on the Baltimore and Ohio Railway, west of the ferry, just above the armories. At last the militia commenced to arrive, and the movements to cut off Brown's men began. The Jefferson Guards crossed the Potomac, came down to the Maryland side, and seized the Potomac Bridge. The local company was sent to take the Shenandoah Bridge, leave a guard, and march to the rear of the arsenal, while another local company was to seize the houses in front of the arsenal. As strangers poured in, says Anderson, the enemy took positions round about, so as to prevent any escape, within shooting distance of the engine house and arsenal. Captain Brown, seeing their maneuvers, said, "We will hold on to our 3 positions, if they are unwilling to come to terms, and die like men." End of section 16. Section 17 of John Brown by W.E.B. Du Bois. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Blow. Part 2. The attack came at noon from the Jefferson Guards, who started across the Potomac Bridge from Maryland. This is Anderson's story. It was about 12 o'clock in the day when we were first attacked by the troops. Prior to that, Captain Brown, in anticipation of further trouble, had girded to his side the famous sword taken from Colonel Lewis Washington the night before, and with that memorable weapon he commanded his men against General Washington's own state. When the captain received the news that the troops had entered the bridge from the Maryland side, he, with some of his men, went into the street, and sent a message to the arsenal for us to come forth also. We hastened to the street as he ordered, when he said, "The troops are on the bridge coming into town. We will give them a warm reception." He then walked around amongst us, giving us words of encouragement in this wise: "Men, be cool. Don't waste your powder and shot. Take aim and make every shot count. The troops will look for us to retreat on their first appearance. Be careful to shoot first." Our men were well supplied with firearms, but Captain Brown had no rifle at that time. His only weapon was the sword before mentioned. The troops soon came out of the bridge and up the street facing us, we occupying an irregular position. When they got within 60 or 70 yards, Captain Brown said, "Let's go upon them," which we did, when several of them fell. Again and again the dose was repeated. There was now consternation among the troops. From marching in solid martial columns, they became scattered. Some hastened to seize upon and bear up the wounded and dying. Several lay dead upon the ground. They seemed not to realize at first that we would fire upon them, but evidently expected that we would be driven out by them without firing. Captain Brown seemed fully to understand the matter, and hence, very properly and in our defense, undertook to forestall their movements. The consequence of their unexpected reception was, after leaving several of their dead on the field, they beat a confused retreat into the bridge, and there stayed under cover until reinforcements came to the ferry. On the retreat of the troops, we were ordered back to our former posts. At this time the negro Newby was killed, and his assailant shot in turn by Green. 2 slaves also died fighting. Now there was comparative quiet for a time, except that the citizens seemed to be wild with terror. Men, women, and children forsook the place in great haste, climbing up hillsides and scaling the mountains. The latter seemed to be alive with white fugitives, fleeing from their doomed city. During this time, William Thompson, who was returning from his errand to the Kennedy farm, was surrounded on the bridge by railroad men, who next came up, and taken a prisoner to the Wager House. It was now 1 o'clock in the day, and while things were going against Brown, his cause was not desperate. His Maryland men might yet attack the disorganized Jefferson Guards in the rear, and the arsenal was full of hostages. But militia and citizens kept pouring into the town, and by 3 o'clock could be seen coming from every direction. Kagi sent word to Brown urging retreat, but Brown faced a difficult dilemma. Should he go to Loudon Heights and lose half his men and all his munitions, or should he retreat to Maryland? This latter path lay open, he was sure, by means of his hostages. Meantime, the Maryland party might appear at any moment. Indeed, the Jefferson Guards had once been mistaken for them. On this account, the message was sent back to Kagi to hold out for a few minutes when we would all evacuate the place. Still the Maryland party lingered with the stubborn Tidd somewhere up the road, and Cook idly kicking his heels at the schoolhouse. The messenger, Jerry Anderson, was fired on and mortally wounded before he reached Kagi, and the latter's party was attacked by a large force and driven into the river. The river at that point runs rippling over a rocky bed, writes a Virginian, and at ordinary stages of the water is easily forded. The raiders, finding their retreat to the opposite shore intercepted by Medler's men, made for a large flat rock near the middle of the stream. Before reaching it, however, Kagi fell and died in the water, apparently without a struggle. 4 others reached the rock, where, for a while, they made an ineffectual stand, returning the fire of the citizens. But it was not long before 2 of them were killed outright, and another prostrated by a mortal wound, leaving Copeland, a mulatto, standing alone unharmed upon their rock of refuge. Thereupon a Harper's Ferry man, James H. Holt, dashed into the river, gun in hand, to capture Copeland, who, as he approached him, made a show of fight by pointing his gun at Holt, who halted and leveled his. But to the surprise of the lookers-on, neither of their weapons were discharged, both having been rendered temporarily useless, as I afterward learned, from being wet. Holt, however, as he again advanced, continued to snap his gun, while Copeland did the same. Copeland was taken alive, and Lehman, with a second message from Kagi to Brown, was killed. Matters were now getting desperate, but the armory was full of prisoners, and therein lay John Brown's final hope. Easily, as a last resort, he could use these citizens as a screen, and so escape to the mountains. In attempting this, however, some of the prisoners were bound to be killed, and Brown hesitated at sacrificing innocent blood to save himself. He thought that the same end might be accomplished by negotiation. His first move, therefore, was to withdraw all his force and the important prisoners to a small brick building near the Armory Gate, called the Engine House. Captain Dangerfield, one of the prisoners, says, "He entered the engine house carrying his prisoners along, or rather part of them, for he made selections. After getting into the engine house, he made this speech: 'Gentlemen, perhaps you wonder why I have selected you from the others. It is because I believe you to be the most influential, and I have only to say now that you will have to share precisely the same fate that your friends extend to my men.' He began at once to bar the doors and windows and to cut portholes through the brick wall." This evident weakening of the raiders let pandemonium loose. The citizens realized how small a force Brown had, and were filled with fury at his presumption. His men began to fight desperately for their lives. About the time when Brown immured himself, a narrator reports, a company of Berkeley County militia arrived from Martinsburg, who, with some citizens of Harper's Ferry and the surrounding country, made a rush on the armory, and released the great mass of the prisoners outside of the engine house, not, however, without suffering some loss from a galling fire kept up by the enemy from the fort. This released the arms, and one of the Virginia watchmen says, "The people, who came pouring into town, broke into liquor saloons, filled up, and then got into the arsenal, arming themselves with the United States guns and ammunition. They kept shooting at random and howling." The prisoners within the engine house heard a terrible firing from without at every point from which the windows could be seen, and in a few minutes every window was shattered, and hundreds of balls came through the doors. These shots were answered from within whenever the attacking party could be seen. This was kept up most of the day, and, strange to say, not a prisoner was hurt, though thousands of balls were embedded in the walls, and holes shot in the doors almost large enough for a man to creep through. The doomed raiders saw volley upon volley discharged, while the echoes from the hills, the shrieks of the townspeople, and the groans of their wounded and dying, all of which filled the air, were truly frightful. Yet no powder and ball were wasted. We shot from under cover, and took deadly aim. For an hour before the flag of truce was sent out, the firing was uninterrupted, and one and another of the enemy were constantly dropping to the earth. Oliver Brown was shot and died without a word, and Taylor was mortally wounded. The mayor of the city ventured out, unarmed, to reconnoiter and was killed. Immediately, the son of Andrew Hunter, who afterward was state's attorney against Brown, rushed into the hotel after the prisoner, William Thompson. We burst into the room where he was and found several around him, but they offered only a feeble resistance. We brought our guns down to his head repeatedly, myself and another person, for the purpose of shooting him in the room. There was a young lady there, the sister of Mr. Folk, the hotel keeper, who sat in this man's lap, covered his face with her arms, and shielded him with her person whenever we brought our guns to bear. She said to us, "For God's sake, wait, and let the law take its course." My associates shouted to kill him. "Let us shed his blood," were his words. All round were shouting, "Mr. Beckham's life was worth 10,000 of these vile abolitionists." I was cool about it and deliberate. My gun was pushed by someone who seized the barrel, and I then moved to the back part of the room, still with purpose unchanged, but with a view to divert attention from me, in order to get an opportunity, at some moment when the crowd would be less dense, to shoot him. After a moment's thought, it occurred to me that that was not the proper place to kill him. We then proposed to take him out and hang him. Some portion of our band then opened a way to him, and first pushing Miss Folk aside, we slung him out of doors. I gave him a push, and many others did the same. We then shoved him along the platform and down to the trestle work of the bridge. He begged for his life all the time, very piteously at first. Thus he was shot to death as he crawled in the trestle work. The prisoners in the engine house now urged Brown to make terms with the citizens, representing that this was possible and that he and his men could escape. Brown sent his son Watson with a white flag, but the maddened citizens paid no attention to it and shot him down. A lull in the fighting came a little later, and Stevens took a second flag of truce, but was captured and held prisoner. Dangerfield says, "At night the firing ceased, for we were in total darkness, and nothing could be seen in the engine house. During the day and night I talked much with Brown. I found him as brave as a man could be, and sensible upon all subjects except slavery. He believed it was his duty to free the slaves, even if in doing so he lost his own life. During a sharp fight, one of Brown's sons was killed. He fell, then trying to raise himself, he said, 'It is all over with me,' and died instantly. Brown did not leave his post at the porthole, but when the fighting was over, he walked to his son's body, straightened out his limbs, took off his trappings, and then, turning to me, said, 'This is the third son I have lost in this cause.' Another son had been shot in the morning, and was then dying, having been brought in from the street. Often during the affair at the engine house, when his men would want to fire upon someone who might be seen passing, Brown would stop them, saying, 'Don't shoot, that man is unarmed.' The firing was kept up by our men all day and until late at night, and during this time several of his men were killed, but none of the prisoners were hurt, though in great danger. During the day and night many propositions, pro and con, were made, looking to Brown's surrender and the release of the prisoners, but without result." Another eyewitness says, "A little before night Brown asked if any of his captives would volunteer to go out among the citizens and induce them to cease firing on the fort, as they were endangering the lives of their friends, the prisoners. He promised on his part that if there was no more firing on his men, there should be none by them on the besiegers. Mr. Israel Russell undertook the dangerous duty. The risk arose from the excited state of the people, who would be likely to fire on anything seen stirring around the prison house, and the citizens were persuaded to stop firing in consideration of the danger incurred of injuring the prisoners. It was now dark, and the wildest excitement existed in the town, especially among the friends of the killed, wounded, and prisoners of the citizens' party. It had rained some little all day, and the atmosphere was raw and cold. Now a cloudy and moonless sky hung like a pall over the scene of war, and, on the whole, a more dismal night cannot be imagined. Guards were stationed round the engine house to prevent Brown's escape, and, as forces were constantly arriving from Winchester, Frederick City, Baltimore, and other places, to help the Harper's Ferry people, the town soon assumed quite a military appearance. The United States authorities in Washington had been notified in the meantime, and in the course of the night, Colonel Robert E. Lee, afterward the famous General Lee of the Southern Confederacy, arrived with a force of United States Marines to protect the interests of the government and kill or capture the invaders. Meantime, Cook had awakened to the fact that something was wrong. He left Tidd at the schoolhouse and started toward the ferry. Finding it surrounded, he fired one volley from a tree and fled. He found no one at the schoolhouse, but met Tidd, the whole farm guard, and one negro on the road beyond. They all turned and fled north, Tidd and Cook quarreling. They wandered 14 days in rain and snow, and finally all escaped except Cook, who went into a town for food and was arrested. Robert E. Lee, with 100 Marines, arrived just before midnight on Monday, and one of the prisoners tells the story of the last stand. When Colonel Lee came with his government troops in the night, he at once sent a flag of truce by his aide, J.E.B. Stuart, to notify Brown of his arrival, and, in the name of the United States, to demand his surrender, advising him to throw himself on the clemency of the government. Brown declined to accept Colonel Lee's terms, and determined to await the attack. When Stuart was admitted and a light brought, he exclaimed, "Why, aren't you old Osawatomie Brown of Kansas, whom I once had there as my prisoner?" "Yes," was the answer, "but you did not keep me." This was the first intimation we had of Brown's real name. When Colonel Lee advised Brown to trust to the clemency of the government, Brown responded that he knew what that meant, a rope for his men and himself, adding, "I prefer to die just here." Stuart told him he would return at early morning for his final reply, and left him. When he had gone, Brown at once proceeded to barricade the doors, windows, etc., endeavoring to make the place as strong as possible. All this time, no one of Brown's men showed the slightest fear, but calmly awaited the attack, selecting the best situations to fire from, and arranging their guns and pistols so that a fresh one could be taken up as soon as one was discharged. When Lieutenant Stuart came in the morning for the final reply to the demand to surrender, I got up and went to Brown's side to hear his answer. Stuart asked, "Are you ready to surrender and trust to the mercy of the government?" Brown answered, "No, I prefer to die here." His manner did not betray the least alarm. Stuart stepped aside and made a signal for the attack, which was instantly begun with sledgehammers to break down the door. Finding it would not yield, the soldiers seized a long ladder for a battering ram and commenced beating the door with that, the party within firing incessantly. I had assisted in the barricading, fixing the fastenings so that I could remove them on the first effort to get in. But I was not at the door when the battering began, and could not get to the fastenings till the ladder was used. I then quickly removed the fastenings, and, after 2 or 3 strokes of the ladder, the engine rolled partially back, making a small aperture, through which Lieutenant Green of the Marines forced his way, jumped on top of the engine, and stood a second amidst a shower of balls, looking for John Brown. When he saw Brown, he sprang about 12 feet at him, giving an underthrust of his sword, striking Brown about midway the body, and raising him completely from the ground. Brown fell forward with his head between his knees, while Green struck him several times over the head, and, as I then supposed, split his skull at every stroke. I was not 2 feet from Brown at that time. Of course, I got out of the building as soon as possible, and did not know till some time later that Brown was not killed. It seems that Green's sword, in making the thrust, struck Brown's belt and did not penetrate the body. The sword was bent double. The reason that Brown was not killed when struck on the head was that Green was holding his sword in the middle, striking with the hilt, and making only scalp wounds. After the attack on the troops at the bridge, Brown had ordered O.P. Anderson, Hazlitt, and Green back to the arsenal. But Green saw the desperate strait of Brown and chose, voluntarily, to go into the engine house and fight until the last. Anderson and Hazlitt, when they saw the door battered in, went to the back of the arsenal, climbed the wall, and fled along the railway that goes up the Shenandoah. Here in the cliffs they had a skirmish with the troops, but finally escaped in the night, crossed the town and the Potomac, and so got into Maryland and went to the farm. It was deserted and pillaged. Then they came back to the schoolhouse and found that empty. In the morning they heard firing, and Anderson's narrative continues. Hazlitt thought it must be Owen Brown and his men trying to force their way into the town, as they had been informed that a number of us had been taken prisoners, and we started down along the ridge to join them. When we got inside of the ferry, we saw the troops firing across the river to the Maryland side with considerable spirit. Looking closely, we saw, to our surprise, that they were firing upon a few of the colored men, who had been armed the day before by our men at the Kennedy farm, and stationed down at the schoolhouse by C.P. Tidd. They were in the bushes on the edge of the mountains, dodging about, occasionally exposing themselves to the enemy. The troops crossed the bridge in pursuit of them, but they retreated in different directions. Being further in the mountains and more secure, we could see without personal harm befalling us. One of the colored men came toward where we were when we hailed him, and inquired about the particulars. He said that one of his comrades had been shot and was lying on the side of the mountains, that they thought the men who had armed them the day before must be in the ferry. That opinion, we told him, was not correct. We asked him to join with us in hunting up the rest of the party, but he declined and went on his way. While we were in this part of the mountains, some of the troops went to the schoolhouse and took possession of it. On our return along up the ridge, from our position, screened by the bushes, we could see them as they invested it. Our last hope of shelter or of meeting our companions now being destroyed, we concluded to make our escape north. Anderson managed to get away, but Hazlitt was captured in Pennsylvania and was returned to Virginia. Thus, John Brown's raid ended. 7 of the men, John Brown himself, Shields Green, Edwin Coppock, Stevens and Copeland, and eventually Cook and Hazlitt, were captured and hanged. Watson and Oliver Brown, the 2 Thompsons, Coggy, Jerry Anderson, Taylor, Newby, Leary, and John Anderson, 10 in all, were killed in the fight, and 6 others, Owen Brown, Tidd, Lehman, Barclay Coppock, Merriam, and O. Anderson, escaped. At high noon on Tuesday, October 18th, the raid was over. John Brown lay wounded and blood-stained on the floor, and the governor of Virginia bent over him. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is John Brown. I have been well known as Old John Brown of Kansas. 2 of my sons were killed here today, and I'm dying too. I came here to liberate slaves, and was to receive no reward. I have acted from a sense of duty, and am content to await my fate, but I think the crowd have treated me badly. I am an old man. Yesterday I could have killed whom I chose, but I had no desire to kill any person, and would not have killed a man had they not tried to kill me and my men. I could have sacked and burned the town, but did not. I have treated the persons whom I took as hostages kindly, and I appeal to them for the truth of what I say. If I had succeeded in running off slaves this time, I could have raised 20 times as many men as I have now for a similar expedition. But I have failed." End of section 17. Section 18 of John Brown by W.E.B. Du Bois. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The Riddle of the Sphinx. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. The deed was done. The next day the world knew, and the world sat in puzzled amazement. It was ever so, and ever will be. When a prophet like John Brown appears, how must we of the world receive him? Must we follow out the drear, dread logic of surrounding facts, as did the South, even if they crucify a clean and pure soul, simply because consistent allegiance to our cherished, chosen ideal demands it? If we do, the shame will brand our latest history. Shall we hesitate and waver before his clear white logic, now helping, now fearing to help, now believing, now doubting? Yes, this we must do so long as doubt and hesitation are genuine, but we must not lie. If we are human, we must thus hesitate until we know the right. How shall we know it? That is the riddle of the Sphinx. We are but darkened, groping souls that know not light, often because of its very blinding radiance. Only in time is truth revealed. Today, at last, we know. John Brown was right. Yet there are some great principles to guide us. That there are in this world matters of vast human import which are eternally right or eternally wrong, all men believe. Whether that great light comes, as the simpler, clearer-minded think, from the spoken word of God, or whether it is simply another way of saying, this deed makes for the good of mankind, or that for the ill. However it may be, all men know that there are, in this world, here and there and again, great partings of the ways, the one way wrong, the other right, in some vast and eternal sense. This certainty is true at times, in the mighty crises of lives and nations. On the other hand, it is also true, as human experience again and again shows, that the usual matters of human debate and difference of opinion are not so vitally important or so easily classified. that in most cases there is much of right and wrong on both sides, and so usual it is to find this true, that men tend to argue it always so. Their life morality becomes always a wavering path of expediency, not necessarily the best or the worst path, as they freely, even smilingly admit, but a good path, a safe path, a path of little resistance, and one that leads to the good, if not to the theoretical, but usually impracticable, best. Such philosophy of the world's ways is common, and probably it is well that thus it is. And yet we all feel its temporary, tentative character. We instinctively distrust its comfortable tone, and listen almost fearfully for the greater voice. Its better is often so far below that which we feel is a possible best, that its present temporizing seems evil to us, and ever and again after the world has complacently dodged and compromised with, and skilfully evaded, a great evil, there shines suddenly a great white light, an unwavering, unflickering brightness, blinding by its all-seeing brilliance, making the whole world simply a light and a darkness, a right and a wrong. Then men tremble and writhe and waver. They whisper, But of course, the thing is plain, but it is too plain to be true. It is true, but truth is not the only thing in the world." Thus they hide from the light, they burrow and grovel, and yet ever in and through and on them blazes that mighty light with its horror of darkness, and behind it peals the voice, the riddle of the Sphinx, that must be answered. Such a light was the soul of John Brown. He was simple, exasperatingly simple, unlettered, plain, and homely. No casuistry of culture or of learning, of well-being or tradition moved him in the slightest degree. "Slavery is wrong," he said. "Kill it. Destroy it. Uproot it. Stem, blossom, and branch. Give it no quarter. Exterminate it, and do it now." Was he wrong? No. The forcible staying of human uplift by barriers of law and might and tradition is the most wicked thing on earth. It is wrong, eternally wrong. It is wrong by whatever name it is called, or in whatever guise it lurks, and whenever it appears. But it is especially heinous, black, and cruel when it masquerades in the robes of law and justice and patriotism. So was American slavery clothed in 1859, and it had to die by revolution, not by milder means. And this men knew. They had known it 100 years, yet they shrank and trembled. From round about the white and blinding path of this soul flew equivocations, lies, thievings, and red murders. And yet all men instinctively felt that these things were not of the light, but of the surrounding darkness. It is at once surprising, baffling, and pitiable to see the way in which men, honest American citizens, faced this light. Many types met and answered the argument John Brown. For he did not use argument, he was himself an argument. First there was the Western American, the typical American, like Charles Robinson, one to whose imagination the empire of the Vale of the Mississippi appealed with tremendous force. Then there was the abolitionist, shading away from him who held slavery an incubus to him who saw its sin, of whom Gerrit Smith was a fair type. Then there was the lover of men, like Dr. Howe, and the merchant errant, like Stearns. Finally, there were the two great fateful types, the master and the slave. To Robinson, Brown was simply a means to an end. Beyond that, he was whatever prevailing public opinion indicated. When the gratitude of Osawatomie swelled high, Brown was fit to be named with Jesus Christ. When the wave of Southern reaction subjugated the nation, he was something less than a fanatic. But whatever he was the sword on which struggling Kansas and its leaders could depend, the untarnished doer of its darker deeds, when they that knew them necessary cowered and held their hands. Brown's was not the only hand that freed Kansas, but his hand was indispensable, and not the first time, nor the last, has a cool and skillful politician like Robinson climbed to power on the heads of those helpers of his whose half-realized ideals he bartered for present possibilities. Human freedom for statehood. For the abolitionist of the Garrison type, Brown had a contempt, as undeserved as it was natural to his genius. To recognize an evil and not strike it was to John Brown sinful. "Talk, talk, talk," he said derisively. Nor did he rightly gauge the value of spiritual as contrasted with physical blows until the day when he himself struck the greatest on the Charleston scaffold. But if John Brown failed rightly to gauge the movement of the abolitionists, few of them failed to appreciate him when they met him. Instinctively, they knew him as one who grasped the very pith and kernel of the evil which they fought. They asked no proofs or credentials. They asked John Brown. So it was with Gerrit Smith. He saw Brown and believed in him. He entertained him at his house. He heard his detailed plans for striking slavery a heart blow. He gave him, in all, over $1,000, and bade him Godspeed. Yet when the blow was struck, he was filled with immeasurable consternation. He equivocated, and even denied knowledge of Brown's plans. To be sure, he, his family, his fortune were in the shadow of danger. But where was John Brown? So with Dr. Howe, whose memory was painfully poor on the witness stand, and who fluttered from enthusiastic support of Brown to a weak wavering when once he had tasted the famous Southern hospitality. He found slavery, to his own intense surprise, human, not ideally and horribly devilish, but only humanly bad. Was a bad human institution to be attacked vi et armis? Or was it not rather to be met with persuasive argument in the soft shade of a Carolina veranda? Dr. Howe inclined to the latter thought after his Cuban visit, and he was exceedingly annoyed and scared after the raid. He fled precipitately to Canada. Of the Boston Committee, only Stearns stood up and out in the public glare, and said unequivocally, then and there, "I believe John Brown to be the representative man of this century, as Washington was of the last. The Harper's Ferry affair, and the capacity shown by the Italians for self-government, the great events of this age. One will free Europe, and the other America." The attitude of the black man toward John Brown is typified by Frederick Douglass and Shields Green. Said Douglass, "On the evening when the news came that John Brown had taken and was then holding the town of Harper's Ferry, it so happened that I was speaking to a large audience in National Hall, Philadelphia. The announcement came upon us with the startling effect of an earthquake. It was something to make the boldest hold his breath." Wise and Buchanan started immediately on Douglass's track, and he fled to Canada and eventually to England. Why did not Douglass join John Brown? Because, first, he was of an entirely different cast of temperament and mind, and because, secondly, he knew, as only a Negro slave can know, the tremendous might and organization of the slave power. Brown's plan never in the slightest degree appealed to Douglass's reason. That the Underground Railroad methods could be enlarged and systematized, Douglass believed, but any further plan he did not think possible. Only national force could dislodge national slavery. As it was with Douglass, so it was practically with the Negro race. They believed in John Brown, but not in his plan. He touched their warm, loving hearts, but not their hard heads. The Canadian Negroes, for instance, were men who knew what slavery meant. They had suffered its degradation, its repression, and its still more fatal license. They knew the slave system. They had been slaves. They had risked life to help loved ones to escape its far-reaching tentacles. They had reached a land of freedom and had begun to taste the joy of being human. Their little homes were clustering about. They had their churches, lodges, social gatherings, and newspaper. Then came the call. They loved the old man and cherished him, helped and forwarded his work in 1,000 little ways. But the call? Were they asked to sacrifice themselves to free their fellow slaves? Were they not quite ready? No. To do that, they stood ever ready. But here they were asked to sacrifice themselves for the sake of possibly freeing a few slaves and certainly arousing the nation. They saw what John Brown did not fully realize until the last, the tremendous meaning of sacrifice, even though his enterprise failed, and they were sure it would fail. Yet in truth, it need not have failed. History and military science prove its essential soundness. But the Negro knew little of history and military science. He did know slavery and the slave power, and they loomed large and invincible in his fertile imagination. He could not conceive their overthrow by anything short of the direct voice of God. That a supreme sacrifice of human beings on the altar of Moloch might hasten the day of emancipation was possible. But were they called to give their lives to this forlorn hope? Most of them said no, as most of their fellows, black and white, ever answer to the voice without reply. They said it reluctantly, slowly, even hesitatingly, but they said it, even as their leader Douglas said it. And why not, they argued? Was not their whole life already a sacrifice? Were they called by any right of God or man to give more than they already had given? What more did they owe the world? Did not the world owe them an unpayable amount? Then, too, the sacrifice demanded of black men in this raid was far more than that demanded of whites. In 1859, it was a crime for a free black man even to set foot on Virginia soil, and it was slavery or death for a fugitive to return. If worse came to worst, the Negro stood the least chance of escape and the least consideration on capture. Yet despite all this, and despite the terrible training of slavery in cowardice, submission, and fatality, the systematic elimination, by death and cruelty, of strength and self-respect and bravery, there were, in Canada and in the United States, scores of Negroes ready for the sacrifice. But the necessary secrecy, vagueness, and intangibility of the summons, the repeated changes of date, the difficulty of communication, and the poverty of black men, all made effective cooperation exceedingly difficult. Even as it was, 15 or 20 Negroes had enlisted, and would probably have been present had they had the time. 5, probably 6, actually came in time, and 30 or 40 slaves actively helped. Considering the mass of Negroes in the land and the character of the leader, this was an insignificant number. But what it lacked in number it made up in characters like Shields Green. He was a poor, unlettered fugitive, ignorant by the law of the land, stricken in life and homely in body. He sat and listened as Douglas and Brown argued amid the boulders of that old Chambersburg quarry. Some things he understood, some he did not. But one thing he did understand, and that was the soul of John Brown. So he said, "I guess I'll go with the old man." Again, in the sickening fury of that fatal Monday, a white man and a black man found themselves standing with freedom before them. The white man was John Brown's truest companion, and the black man was Shields Green. "I told him to come," said the white man afterward, "that we could do nothing more." But he simply said, "I must go down to the old man," and he went down to John Brown, and to death. If this was the attitude of the slave, what was that of the master? It was when John Brown faced the indignant, self-satisfied, and arrogant slave power of the South, flanked by its northern Vallandigams, that the mighty paradox and burning farce of the situation revealed itself. Picture the situation. An old and blood-bespattered man, half dead from the wounds inflicted but a few hours before. A man lying in the cold and dirt, without sleep for 55 nerve-wrecking hours, without food for nearly as long, with the dead bodies of 2 sons almost before his eyes, the piled corpses of his 7 slain comrades near and afar, a wife and a bereaved family listening in vain, and a lost cause, the dream of a lifetime, lying dead in his heart. Around him was a group of bitter, inquisitive Southern aristocrats and their satellites, headed by one of the foremost leaders of subsequent secession. "Who sent you? Who sent you?" these inquisitors insisted. "No man sent me. I acknowledge no master in human form." "What was your object in coming?" "We came to free the slaves." "How do you justify your acts?" "You are guilty of a great wrong against God and humanity, and it would be perfectly right for anyone to interfere with you so far as to free those you willfully and wickedly hold in bondage. I think I did right, and that others will do right who interfere with you at any time and at all times. I hold that the golden rule, 'Do unto others as ye would that others should do unto you,' applies to all who would help others to gain their liberty." "But don't you believe in the Bible?" "Certainly I do." "Do you consider this a religious movement?" "It is, in my opinion, the greatest service man can render to God." "Do you consider yourself an instrument in the hands of Providence?" "I do." "Upon what principles do you justify your acts?" "Upon the golden rule. I pity the poor in bondage that have none to help them. That is why I am here, not to gratify any personal animosity, revenge, or vindictive spirit. It is my sympathy with the oppressed and the wronged, that are as good as you and as precious in the sight of God." "Certainly. But why take the slaves against their will?" "I never did." "Who are your advisers in this movement?" "I have numerous sympathizers throughout the entire North. I want you to understand that I respect the rights of the poorest and the weakest of colored people, oppressed by the slave system, just as much as I do those of the most wealthy and powerful. That is the idea that has moved me, and that alone. We expected no reward except satisfaction of endeavoring to do for those in distress and greatly oppressed as we would be done by. The cry of distress of the oppressed is my reason, and the only thing that prompted me to come here." "Why did you do it secretly?" "Because I thought that necessary to success, no other reason. I agree with Mr. Smith that moral suasion is hopeless. I don't think the people of the slave states will ever consider the subject of slavery in its true light till some other argument is resorted to than moral suasion." "Did you expect a general rising of the slaves in case of your success?" "No, sir, nor did I wish it. I expected to gather them up from time to time and set them free." "Did you expect to hold possession here till then?" "You overrate your strength in supposing I could have been taken if I had not allowed it. I was too tardy after commencing the open attack, in delaying my movements through Monday night, and up to the time I was attacked by the government troops." "Where did you get your arms?" "I bought them." "In what state?" "That I will not state. I have nothing to say, only that I claim to be here in carrying out a measure I believe perfectly justifiable, and not to act the part of an incendiary or ruffian, but to aid those suffering great wrong. I wish to say, furthermore, that you had better, all you people at the South, prepare yourselves for a settlement of this question, that must come up for settlement sooner than you are prepared for it. The sooner you are prepared, the better. You may dispose of me very easily. I am nearly disposed of now. But this question is still to be settled. This Negro question, I mean. The end of that is not yet. Brown, suppose you had every nigger in the United States. What would you do with them?" "Set them free." "Your intention was to carry them off and free them?" "Not at all." "To set them free would sacrifice the life of every man in this community." "I do not think so." "I know it. I think you are fanatical." "And I think you are fanatical. Whom the gods would destroy they first make mad, and you are mad." "Was it your only object to free the negroes?" "Absolutely our only object." "You are a robber!" cried some voice in the crowd. "You slaveholders are robbers," retorted Brown. But Governor Wise interrupted. "Mr. Brown, the silver of your hair is reddened by the blood of crime, and you should eschew these hard words and think upon eternity. You are suffering from wounds, perhaps fatal, and should you escape death from these causes, you must submit to a trial which may involve death. Your confessions justify the presumption that you will be found guilty, and even now you are committing a felony under the laws of Virginia by uttering sentiments like these. It is better you should turn your attention to your eternal future than be dealing in denunciations which can only injure you." John Brown replied, "Governor, I have, from all appearances, not more than 15 or 20 years the start of you in the journey to that eternity of which you kindly warn me, and whether my time here shall be 15 months, or 15 days, or 15 hours, I am equally prepared to go. There is an eternity behind and an eternity before, and this little speck in the center, however long, is but comparatively a minute. The difference between your tenure and mine is trifling, and I therefore tell you to be prepared. I am prepared. You have a heavy responsibility, and it behooves you to prepare more than it does me." Thus, from the day John Brown was captured to the day he died, and after, it was the South and slavery that was on trial, not John Brown. Indeed, the dilemma into which John Brown's raid threw the state of Virginia was perfect. If his foray was the work of a handful of fanatics, led by a lunatic and repudiated by the slaves to a man, then the proper procedure would have been to ignore the incident, quietly punish the worst offenders, and either pardon the misguided leader or send him to an asylum. If, on the other hand, Virginia faced a conspiracy that threatened her social existence, aroused dangerous unrest in her slave population, and was full of portent for the future, then extraordinary precaution, swift and extreme punishment, and bitter complaint were only natural. But both these situations could not be true. Both horns of the dilemma could not be logically seized. Yet this was precisely what the South and Virginia sought. While insisting that the raid was too hopelessly and ridiculously small to accomplish anything, and saying, with Andrew Hunter, that not a single one of the slaves joined John Brown except by coercion, the state nevertheless spent $250,000 to punish the invaders, stationed from 1 to 3,000 soldiers in the vicinity, and threw the nation into turmoil. When the inconsistency of this action struck various minds, the attempt was made to exaggerate the danger of the invading white men. The presiding judge at the trial wrote, as late as 1889, that the number in Brown's party was proven by witnesses to have been 75 to 100, and he expected large reinforcements, while Andrew Hunter, the state's attorney, saw nationwide conspiracies. What then was the truth about the matter? It was as Frederick Douglass said 22 years later on the very spot. If John Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, he did at least begin the war that ended slavery. If we look over the dates, places, and men for which this honor is claimed, we shall find that not Carolina, but Virginia, not Fort Sumter, but Harper's Ferry and the Arsenal, not Major Anderson, but John Brown, began the war that ended American slavery and made this a free republic. Until this blow was struck, the prospect for freedom was dim, shadowy, and uncertain. The irrepressible conflict was one of words, votes, and compromises. When John Brown stretched forth his arm, the sky was cleared. The armed hosts of freedom stood face to face over the chasm of a broken union, and the clash of arms was at hand. The paths by which John Brown's raid precipitated civil war were these. In the first place, he aroused the Negroes of Virginia. How far the knowledge of his plan had penetrated is of course only to be conjectured. Evidently few knew that the foray would take place on October 17th. But when the movement had once made a successful start, there is no doubt that Osborne Anderson knew whereof he spoke when he said that slaves were ready to cooperate. His words were proven by the 200,000 black soldiers in the Civil War. That something was wrong was shown too by 5 incendiary fires in a single week after the raid. Hunter sought to attribute these to Northern emissaries, but this charge was unproven and extremely improbable. The only other possible perpetrators were slaves and free Negroes. That Virginians believed this is shown by Hinton's declaration that the loss in 1859 by the sale of Virginia slaves alone was $10 million. A lady who visited John Brown said, "It was hard for me to forget the presence of the jailer. I had that morning seen his advertisement of 50 Negroes for sale." It is impossible to prove the extent of this clearing out of suspected slaves, but the census reports indicate something of it. The Negro population of Maryland and Virginia increased a little over 4% between 1850 and 1860, but in the 3 counties bordering on Harper's Ferry, Loudoun and Jefferson in Virginia, and Washington in Maryland, the 17,647 slaves of 1850 had shrunk to 15,996 in 1860, a decrease of nearly 10%. This means a disappearance of 2,400 slaves, and is very significant. Secondly, long before John Brown appeared at Harper's Ferry, Southern leaders like Mason, the author of the Fugitive Slave Bill and chairman of the Harper's Ferry Investigating Committee, Jefferson Davis, who was a member of this committee, Wise, Hunter, and other Virginians, had set their faces toward secession as the only method of protecting slavery. Into the mouths of these men John Brown put a tremendous argument and a fearful warning. The argument they used, the warning they suppressed and hushed. The argument was, this is abolitionism. This is the North. This is the kind of treatment which the South and its cherished institution can expect unless it resorts to extreme measures. Proceeding along these lines, they emphasized and enlarged the raid so far as its white participants and Northern sympathizers were concerned. Governor Wise, on November 25th, issued a burning manifesto for the ears of the South and the eyes of President Buchanan, and the majority report of the Senate committee closed with ominous words. On the other hand, the warning of John Brown's raid, the danger of Negro insurrection, was but whispered. Third, and this was the path that led to civil war and far beyond, the raid aroused and directed the conscience of the nation. Strange it was to watch its work. Some impulsive, eager to justify themselves, rushed into print. To Garrison, the non-resistant, the sword of Gideon was abhorrent. Beecher thundered against John Brown, and Seward bitterly traduced him. Then came an ominous silence in the land, while his voice, in his own defense, was heard over the whole country. A great surging throb of sympathy arose and swept the world. That John Brown was legally a lawbreaker and a murderer, all men knew. But wider and wider circles were beginning, dimly and more clearly, to recognize that his lawlessness was in obedience to the highest call of self-sacrifice for the welfare of his fellow men. They began to ask themselves, what is this cause that can inspire such devotion? The reiteration of the simple statement of the brother in bonds could not help but attract attention. The beauty of the conception, despite its possible unearthliness and impracticability, attracted poet and philosopher and common man. To be sure, the nation had long been thinking over the problem of the black man, but never before had its attention been held by such deep, dramatic, and personal interest as in the 40 days from mid-October to December 1859. This arresting of national attention was due to Virginia and to John Brown. To Virginia, by reason of its exaggerated plaint; to John Brown, whose strength, simplicity, and acumen made his trial, incarceration, and execution the most powerful abolition argument yet offered. The very processes by which Virginia used John Brown to fire the Southern heart were used by John Brown to fire the Northern conscience. Andrew Hunter, the prosecuting state's attorney, of right demanded that the trial should be short and the punishment swift, and in this John Brown fully agreed. He had no desire to escape the consequences of his act or to clog the wheels of Virginia justice. After a certain moral bewilderment there in the old engine house at his failure on the brink of success, the true significance of his mission of sacrifice slowly rose before him. In the face of proposals to rescue him, he said, at first thoughtfully, "I do not know that I ought to encourage any attempt to save my life. I am not sure that it would not be better for me to die at this time. I am not incapable of error, and I may be wrong, but I think that perhaps my object would be nearer fulfillment if I should die. I must give it some thought." And more this conviction seized and thrilled him, and he began to say decisively, "I think I cannot now better serve the cause I love so much than to die for it, and in my death I may do more than in my life." And again, "I can trust God with both the time and the manner of my death, believing, as I do now, that for me at this time to seal my testimony for God and humanity with my blood will do vastly more toward advancing the cause I have earnestly endeavored to promote than all I have done in my life before." And then finally came that last great hymn of utter sacrifice. I feel astonished that one so vile and unworthy as I am would even be suffered to have a place anyhow or anywhere amongst the very least of all who when they came to die, as all must, were permitted to pay the debt of nature in defense of the right and of God's eternal and immutable truth. The trial was a difficult experience. Virginia attempted to hold scales of even justice between mob violence and the worldwide sympathy of all good men. To defend its domestic institutions, it must try a man for murder when that very man, sitting as self-appointed judge of those very institutions, had convicted them before a jury of mankind. To defend the good name of the state, Virginia had to restrain the violent blood vengeance of men whose kin had been killed in the raid, and who had sworn that no prisoner should escape the extreme penalty. The trial was legally fair, but pressed to a conclusion in unseemly haste, and in obedience to a threatening public opinion and a great hovering dread. Only against this unfair haste did John Brown protest, for he wanted the world to understand why he had done the deed. On the other hand, Hunter not only feared the local mob, but the slowly arising sentiment for this white-haired crusader. He therefore pushed the proceedings legally, but with almost brutal pertinacity. The prisoner was arraigned while wounded and in bed. The lawyers, hurriedly chosen, were given scant time for consultation or preparation. John Brown was formally committed to jail at Charlestown, the county seat, on October 20th, had a preliminary examination October 25th, and was indicted by the grand jury October 26th, for conspiracy with slaves for the purpose of insurrection, with treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, and with murder in the first degree. Thursday, October 27th, his trial was begun. A jury was impaneled without challenge, and Brown's lawyers, ignoring his outline of defense, brought in the plea of insanity. The old man arose from his couch and said, "I look upon it as a miserable artifice and pretext of those who ought to take a different course in regard to me, if they took any at all, and I view it with contempt more than otherwise. I am perfectly unconscious of insanity, and I reject, so far as I am capable, any attempts to interfere in my behalf on that score." On Friday, a Massachusetts lawyer arrived to help in the trial, and also privately to suggest methods of escape. John Brown quietly refused to contemplate any such attempt, but was glad to accept the aid of this lawyer and two others, who were sent by John A. Andrew and his friends. The judge curtly refused these men any time to prepare their case, but in spite of this, it ran over until Monday, when the jury retired. Late Monday afternoon they returned. Redpath says, "At this moment the crowd filled all the space from the couch inside the bar, around the prisoner, beyond the railing in the body of the court, out through the wide hall, and beyond the doors. There stood the anxious but perfectly silent and attentive populace, stretching head and neck to witness the closing scene of Old Brown's trial. The clerk of the court read the indictment and asked, "Gentlemen of the jury, what say you? Is the prisoner at the bar, John Brown, guilty or not guilty?" "Guilty," answered the foreman. "Guilty of treason and conspiring and advising with slaves and others to rebel, and murder in the first degree?" "Yes." Redpath continues, "Not the slightest sound was heard in this vast crowd as this verdict was thus returned and read. Not the slightest expression of elation or triumph was uttered from the hundreds present, who, a moment before, outside the court, joined in heaping threats and imprecations on his head. Nor was this strange silence interrupted during the whole of the time occupied by the forms of the court. Old Brown himself said not even a word, but, as on any previous day, turned to adjust his pallet, and then composedly stretched himself upon it. The following Wednesday John Brown was sentenced. Moving with painful steps and pale face, he took his seat under the gaslight in the great square room and remained motionless. The judge read his decision on the points of exception, and the clerk asked, "Have you anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon you?" Then, rising and leaning forward, John Brown made that last great speech in a voice at once gentle and firm. "I have, may it please the court, a few words to say. In the first place, I deny everything but what I have all along admitted, the design on my part to free the slaves. I intended certainly to have made a clean thing of that matter, as I did last winter, when I went into Missouri, and there took slaves without the snapping of a gun on either side, moved them through the country, and finally left them in Canada. I designed to have done the same thing again on a larger scale. That was all I intended. I never did intend murder or treason or the destruction of property, or to excite or incite slaves to rebellion, or to make insurrection. I have another objection, and that is, it is unjust that I should suffer such a penalty. Had I interfered in the matter which I admit, and which I admit has been fairly proved, for I admire the truthfulness and candor of the greater portion of the witnesses who have testified in this case, had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. This court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament. That teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds, as bound with them. I endeavor to act up to that instruction. I say, I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. Let me say one word further. I feel entirely satisfied with the treatment I have received on my trial. Considering all the circumstances, it has been more generous than I expected. But I feel no consciousness of guilt. I have stated from the first what was my intention and what was not. I never had any design against the life of any person, nor any disposition to commit treason, or excite slaves to rebel, or make any general insurrection. I never encouraged any man to do so, but always discouraged any idea of that kind. Let me say also a word in regard to the statements made by some of those connected with me. I hear it has been stated by some of them that I have induced them to join me, but the contrary is true. I do not say this to injure them, but as regretting their weakness. There is not one of them but that joined me of his own accord, and the greater part at their own expense. A number of them I never saw, and never had a word of conversation with, till the day they came to me, and that was for the purpose I have stated. Now I have done. The day of his dying, December 2nd, dawned glorious. 24 hours before he had kissed his wife good-bye, and on this morning he visited his doomed companions, Shields Green and Copeland first, then the wavering Cook and Coppock, and the unmovable Stevens. At last he turned toward the place of his hanging. Since early morning 3,000 soldiers had been marching and countermarching around the scaffold, which had been erected a half-mile from Charlestown, encircling it for 15 miles. A hush sat on the hearts of men. John Brown rode out into the morning. "This is a beautiful land," he said. It was beautiful. Wide, glistening, rolling fields flickered in the sunlight. Beyond, the Shenandoah went rolling northward, and still afar rose the mighty masses of the Blue Ridge, where Nat Turner had fought and died, where Gabriel had looked for refuge, and where John Brown had builded his awful dream. Some say he kissed a Negro child as he passed, but Andrew Hunter vehemently denies it. No Negro could get access to him, he says, and he is probably right. And yet all about him as he hung there knelt the funeral guard he prayed for when he said, "My love to all who love their neighbors. I have asked to be spared from having any weak or hypocritical prayers made over me when I am publicly murdered, and that my only religious attendants be poor little dirty, ragged, bareheaded, and barefooted slave boys and girls, led by some gray-haired slave mother. Farewell, farewell." End of section 18. Section 19 of John Brown by W.E.B. Du Bois. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Legacy of John Brown. Part 1. Ho, everyone that thirsteth, come ye to the waters, and he that hath no money, come ye, buy and eat. Yea, come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. I, John Brown, am quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. These were the last written words of John Brown, set down the day he died, the culminating of that wonderful message of his 40 days in prison, which all in all made the mightiest abolition document that America has known. Uttered in chains and solemnity, spoken in the very shadow of death, its dramatic intensity after that wild and puzzling raid, its deep earnestness as embodied in the character of the man, did more to shake the foundations of slavery than any single thing that ever happened in America. Of himself he speaks simply and with satisfaction. I should be 60 years old were I to live to May 9th, 1860. I have enjoyed much of life as it is, and have been remarkably prosperous, having early learned to regard the welfare and prosperity of others as my own. I have never, since I can remember, required a great amount of sleep, so that I conclude that I have already enjoyed full an average number of working hours with those who reach their 80 years and 10. I have not yet been driven to the use of glasses, but can see to read and write quite comfortably. But more than that, I have generally enjoyed remarkably good health. I might go on to recount unnumbered and unmerited blessings, among which would be some very severe afflictions, and those the most needed blessings of all. And now, when I think how easily I might be left to spoil all I have done or suffered in the cause of freedom, I hardly dare wish another voyage, even if I had the opportunity. After a surging, trouble-tossed voyage, he is at last at peace in body and mind. He asserts that he is, and has been, in his right mind. I may be very insane, and I am so if insane at all. But if that be so, insanity is like a very pleasant dream to me. I am not in the least degree conscious of my ravings, my fear, or of any terrible visions whatever, but fancy myself entirely composed, and that my sleep, in particular, is as sweet as that of a healthy, joyous little infant. I pray God that he will grant me a continuance of the same calm but delightful dream, until I come to know of those realities which eyes have not seen and which ears have not heard. I have scarce realized that I am in prison or in irons at all. I certainly think I was never more cheerful in my life." To his family he hands down the legacy of his faith and works. "I beseech you all to live in habitual contentment with moderate circumstances and gains of worldly store, and earnestly to teach this to your children and children's children after you, by example as well as precept. And again, be sure to remember and follow my advice, and my example too, so far as it has been consistent with the holy religion of Jesus Christ, in which I remain a most firm and humble believer. Never forget the poor, nor think anything you bestow on them to be lost to you, even though they may be as black as Ebed-melech, the Ethiopian eunuch, who cared for Jeremiah in the pit of the dungeon, or as black as the one to whom Philip preached Christ. Be sure to entertain strangers, for thereby some have. Remember them that are in bonds, as bound with them." Of his own merit and desert he is modest but firm. The great bulk of mankind estimate each other's actions and motives by the measure of success or otherwise that attends them through life. By that rule I have been one of the worst and one of the best of men. I do not claim to have been one of the latter, and I leave it to an impartial tribunal to decide whether the world has been the worse or the better from my living and dying in it. He has no sense of shame for his action. I feel no consciousness of guilt in that matter, nor even mortification on account of my imprisonment in irons. I feel perfectly sure that very soon no member of my family will feel any possible disposition to blush on my account. I do not feel conscious of guilt in taking up arms, and had it been in behalf of the rich and powerful, the intelligent, the great, as men count greatness, or those who form enactments to suit themselves and corrupt others, or some of their friends, that I interfered, suffered, sacrificed, and fell, it would have been doing very well. But enough of this. These light afflictions, which endure for a moment, shall but work for me a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." With desperate faith he clings to his belief in the providence of an all-wise God. "Under all these terrible calamities I feel quite cheerful in the assurance that God reigns and will overrule all for his glory and the best possible good." True it is that the night is dark and his faith at first wavers, yet it rises ever again triumphant. As I believe most firmly that God reigns, I cannot believe that anything I have done, suffered, or may yet suffer, will be lost to the cause of God or of humanity. And before I began my work at Harper's Ferry, I felt assured that in the worst event it would certainly pay. I often expressed that belief, and I can see now no possible cause to alter my mind. I am not as yet, in the main, at all disappointed. I have been a good deal disappointed as it regards myself in not keeping up to my own plans, but now I feel entirely reconciled to that even, for God's plan was infinitely better, no doubt, or I should have kept to my own. He is, after all, the servant and instrument of the Almighty. If you do not believe I had a murderous intention, while I know I had not, why grieve so terribly on my account? The scaffold has but few terrors for me. God has often covered my head in the day of battle, and granted me many times deliverances that were almost so miraculous that I can scarce realize their truth. And now, when it seems quite certain that he intends to use me in a different way, shall I not most cheerfully go? I have often passed under the rod of him whom I call my Father, and certainly no son ever needed it oftener. and yet I have enjoyed much of life, as I was enabled to discover the secret of this somewhat early. It has been in making the prosperity and happiness of others my own, so that really I have had a great deal of prosperity. I am very prosperous still, and looking forward to a time when peace on earth and goodwill to men shall everywhere prevail. I have no murmuring thoughts or envious feelings to fret my mind. I'll praise my Maker with my breath. Success is, in general, the standard of all merit. I have passed my time quite cheerfully, still trusting that neither my life nor my death will prove a total loss. As regards both, however, I am liable to mistake. It affords me some satisfaction to feel conscious of at least having tried to better the condition of those who are always on the Underhill side, and am in hopes of being able to meet the consequences without a murmur. I am endeavoring to get ready for another field of action, where no defeat befalls the truly brave. That God reigns, and most wisely, and controls all events, might, it would seem, reconcile those who believe it to much that appears to be very disastrous. I am one who has tried to believe that, and still keep trying. I cannot remember a night so dark as to have hindered the coming day, nor a storm so furious or dreadful as to prevent the return of warm sunshine in a cloudless sky. More and more his eyes pierce the gloom and see the vast plan for which God has used him in the glory of his sacrifice. He shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Philistines. This was said of a poor erring servant many years ago, and for many years I have felt a strong impression that God had given me powers and faculties, unworthy as I was, that he intended to use for a similar purpose. This most unmerited honor he has seen fit to bestow, and whether, like the same poor frail man to whom I allude, my death may not be of vastly more value than my life, is, I think, quite beyond all human foresight. I think I feel as happy as Paul did when he lay in prison. He knew if they killed him it would greatly advance the cause of Christ. That was the reason he rejoiced so. On that same ground I do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. Let them hang me. I forgive them, and may God forgive them, for they know not what they do. I have no regret for the transaction for which I am condemned. I went against the laws of men, it is true, but whether it be right to obey God or men, judge ye. When, and in what form death may come, is but of small moment. I feel just as content to die for God's eternal truth and for suffering humanity on the scaffold as in any other way, and I do not say this from disposition to brave it out. No, I would readily own my wrong were I in the least convinced of it. I have now been confined over a month, with a good opportunity to look the whole thing as fair in the face as I am capable of doing, and I feel it most grateful that I am counted in the least possible degree worthy to suffer for the truth. I can trust God with both the time and the manner of my death, believing, as I now do, that for me at this time to seal my testimony for God and humanity with my blood will do vastly more toward advancing the cause I have earnestly endeavored to promote than all I have done in my life before. My whole life before had not afforded me one half the opportunity to plead for the right. In this also I find much to reconcile me to both my present condition and my immediate prospect. Against slavery his face is set like flint. There are no ministers of Christ here. These ministers who profess to be Christian and hold slaves or advocate slavery, I cannot abide them. My knees will not bend in prayer with them while their hands are stained with the blood of souls. He said to one Southern clergyman, "I will thank you to leave me alone. Your prayers would be an abomination to God." To another he said, "I would not insult God by bowing down in prayer with anyone who had the blood of the slave on his skirts." And to a third, who argued in favor of slavery as a Christian institution, John Brown replied impatiently, "My dear sir, you know nothing about Christianity. You will have to learn its ABC. I find you quite ignorant of what the word Christianity means. I respect you as a gentleman, of course, but it is as a heathen gentleman." To his children he wrote, "Be determined to know by experience, as soon as may be, whether Bible instruction is of divine origin or not. Be sure to owe no man anything, but to love one another." John Rogers wrote his children, "Abhor that arrant whore of Rome." John Brown writes to his children to abhor, with undying hatred also, that sum of all villainies, slavery. And finally he rejoiced, "Men cannot imprison or chain or hang the soul. I go joyfully in behalf of millions that have no rights that this great and glorious, this Christian Republic is bound to respect." Strange change in morals, political as well as Christian, since 1776. "No formal will can be of use," he wrote on his doomsday, "when my expressed wishes are made known to my dutiful and beloved family." This was the man. His family is the world. What legacy did he leave? It was soon seen that his voice was a call to the great final battle with slavery. In the spring of 1861, the Boston Light Infantry was sent to Fort Warren in Boston Harbor to drill. A quartet was formed among the soldiers to sing patriotic songs, and for them was contrived the verses, "John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave, his soul is marching on," etc. This was set to the music of an old camp meeting tune, possibly of Negro origin, called "Say, Brother, Will You Meet Us?" The regiment learned it and first sang it publicly when it came up from Fort Warren and marched past the scene where Crispus Attucks fell. Gilmore's band learned and played it, and thus the song of John Brown was started on its eternal way. Was John Brown simply an episode, or was he an eternal truth? And if a truth, how speaks that truth today? John Brown loved his neighbor as himself. He could not endure, therefore, to see his neighbor poor, unfortunate, or oppressed. This natural sympathy was strengthened by a saturation in Hebrew religion which stressed the personal responsibility of every human soul to a just God. To this religion of equality and sympathy with misfortune was added the strong influence of the social doctrines of the French Revolution, with its emphasis on freedom and power in political life. And on all this was built John Brown's own inchoate but growing belief in a more just and a more equal distribution of property. From this he concluded, and acted on that conclusion, that all men are created free and equal, and that the cost of liberty is less than the price of repression. Up to the time of John Brown's death, this doctrine was a growing, conquering, social thing. Since then there has come a change, and many would rightly find reason for that change in the coincidence that the year in which John Brown suffered martyrdom was the year that first published The Origin of Species. Since that day, tremendous scientific and economic advance has been accompanied by distinct signs of moral retrogression in social philosophy. Strong arguments have been made for the fostering of war, the utility of human degradation and disease, and the inevitable and known inferiority of certain classes and races of men. While such arguments have not stopped the efforts of the advocates of peace, the workers for social uplift, and the believers in human brotherhood, they have, it must be confessed, made their voices falter and tinged their arguments with apology. Why is this? It is because the splendid scientific work of Darwin, Weismann, Galton, and others has been widely interpreted as meaning that there is essential and inevitable inequality among men and races of men, which no philanthropy can or ought to eliminate. That civilization is a struggle for existence whereby the weaker nations and individuals will gradually succumb, and the strong will inherit the earth. With this interpretation has gone the silent assumption that the white European stock represents the strong surviving peoples, and that the swarthy yellow and black peoples are the ones rightly doomed to eventual extinction. One can easily see what influence such a doctrine would have on the race problem in America. It meant moral revolution in the attitude of the nation. Those that stepped into the pathway marked by men like John Brown faltered, and large numbers turned back. They said, "He was a good man, even great, but he has no message for us today. He was a belated Covenanter, an anachronism in the age of Darwin, one who gave his life to lift not the unlifted, but the unliftable." We have, consequently, the present reaction, a reaction which says, in effect, keep these black people in their places, and do not attempt to treat a Negro simply as a white man with a black face. To do this would mean the moral deterioration of the race and the nation, a fate against which a divine racial prejudice is successfully fighting. This is the attitude of the larger portion of our thinking people. It is not, however, an attitude that has brought mental rest or social peace. On the contrary, it is today involving a degree of moral strain and political and social anomaly that gives the wisest pause. The chief difficulty has been that the natural place in which by scientific law the black race in America should stay cannot easily be determined. To be sure, the freedmen did not, as the philanthropists of the 60s apparently expected, step, in 40 years, from slavery to 19th century civilization. Neither, on the other hand, did they, as the ex-masters confidently predicted, retrograde and die. Contrary to both these views, they chose a third and apparently quite unawaited way. From the great, sluggish, almost imperceptibly moving mass, they sent off larger and larger numbers of faithful workmen and artisans, some merchants and professional men, and even men of educational ability and discernment. They developed no world geniuses, no millionaires, no great captains of industry, no artists of the first rank. But they did, in 40 years, get rid of the greater part of their total illiteracy, accumulate $500 million of property in small homesteads, and gain, now and then, respectful attention in the world's ears and eyes. It has been argued that this progress of the black man in America is due to the exceptional men among them, and does not measure the ability of the mass. Such an admission is, however, fatal to the whole argument. If the doomed races of men are going to develop exceptions to the rule of inferiority, then no rule, scientific or moral, should or can proscribe the race as such. To meet this difficulty in racial philosophy, a step has been taken in America fraught with the gravest social consequences to the world, and threatening not simply the political, but the moral integrity of the nation. That step is denying, in the case of black men, the validity of those evidences of culture, ability, and decency which are accepted unquestionably in the ease of other people, and by vague assertions, unprovable assumptions, unjust emphasis, and now and then by deliberate untruth, aiming to secure not only the continued proscription of all these people, but by caste distinction, to shut in the faces of their rising classes many of the paths to further advance. When a social policy, based on a supposed scientific sanction, leads to such a moral anomaly, it is time to examine, rather carefully, the logical foundations of the argument. And as soon as we do this, many things are clear. First, assuming the truth of the unproved dictum that there are stocks of human beings whose elimination the best welfare of the world demands, it is certainly questionable if these stocks include the majority of mankind, and it is indefensible and monstrous to pretend that we know today, with any reasonable assurance, which these stocks are. We can point to degenerate individuals and families here and there among all the races, but there is not the slightest warrant for assuming that there does not lie among the Chinese and Hindus, the African Bantus and American Indians, as lofty possibilities of human culture as any European race has ever exhibited. It is, to be sure, puzzling to know why the Sudan should linger 1,000 years in culture behind the valley of the Seine. But it is no more puzzling than the fact that the valley of the Thames was miserably backward as compared with the banks of the Tiber. Climate, human contact, facilities of communication, and what we call accident have played a great part in the rise of culture among nations. To ignore these and assert dogmatically that the present distribution of culture is a fair index of the distribution of human ability and desert is to make an assertion for which there is not the slightest scientific warrant. What the age of Darwin has done is to add to the 18th century idea of individual worth the complementary idea of physical immortality. And this, far from annulling or contracting the idea of human freedom, rather emphasizes its necessity and eternal possibility, the boundlessness and endlessness of human achievement. Freedom has come to mean not individual caprice or aberration, but social self-realization in an endless chain of selves. And freedom for such development is not the denial, but the central assertion of the evolutionary theory. So, too, the doctrine of human equality passes through the fire of scientific inquiry, not obliterated but transfigured, not equality of present attainment, but equality of opportunity, for unbounded future attainment is the rightful demand of mankind. What now does the present hegemony of the white races threaten? It threatens, by means of brutal force, a survival of some of the worst stocks of mankind. It attempts to people the best parts of the earth and put in absolute authority over the rest, not usually, and indeed not mainly, the culture of Europe, but its greed and degradation. Not only some representatives of the best stocks of the West End of London, Upper New York, and the Champs-Élysées, but also, in as large if not larger numbers, the worst stocks of Whitechapel, the East Side, and Montmartre, and it essays to make the slums of white society, in all cases and under all circumstances, the superior of any colored group, no matter what its ability or culture. To be sure, this outrageous program of wholesale human degeneration is not outspoken yet, save in the backward civilizations of the southern United States, South Africa, and Australia. But its enunciation is listened to with respect and tolerance in England, Germany, and the northern states by those very persons who accuse philanthropy with seeking to degrade holy white blood by an infiltration of colored strains. And the average citizen is voting ships and guns to carry out this program. This movement gathered force and strength during the latter half of the 19th century, and reached its culmination when France, Germany, England, and Russia began the partition of China and the East. With the sudden self-assertion of Japan, its wildest dreams collapsed, but it is still today a living, virile, potent force and motive, the most subtle and dangerous enemy of world peace and the dream of human brotherhood. It has a whole vocabulary of its own: the strong races, superior peoples, race preservation, the struggle for survival, and a variety of terms meaning the right of white men of any kind to beat blacks into submission, make them surrender their wealth and the use of their women, and submit to dictation without murmur, for the sake of being swept off the fairest portions of the earth, or held there in perpetual serfdom or guardianship. Ignoring the fact that the era of physical struggle for survival has passed away among human beings, and that there is plenty of room accessible on earth for all, this theory makes the possession of Krupp guns the main criterion of mental stamina and moral fitness. End of section 19. Section 20 of John Brown by W.E.B. Du Bois. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Legacy of John Brown, Part 2. Even armed with this morality of the club and every advantage of modern culture, the white races have been unable to possess the earth. Many signs of degeneracy have appeared among them. Their birth rate is falling, their average ability is not increasing, their physical stamina is impaired, and their social condition is not reassuring. Lacking the physical ability to take possession of the world, they are today fencing in America, Australia, and South Africa, and declaring that no dark race shall occupy or develop the land which they themselves are unable to use. And all this on the plea that their stock is threatened with deterioration from without, when in reality its most dangerous threat is deterioration from within. We are, in fact, today repeating in our intercourse between races all the former evils of class distinction within the nation: personal hatred and abuse, mutual injustice, unequal taxation, and rigid caste. Individual nations outgrew these fatal things by breaking down the horizontal barriers between classes. We are bringing them back by seeking to erect vertical barriers between races. Men were told that abolition of compulsory class distinction meant leveling down, degradation, disappearance of culture and genius, and the triumph of the mob. As a matter of fact, it has been the salvation of European civilization. Some deterioration and leveling there was, but it was more than balanced by the discovery of new reservoirs of ability and strength. So today we are told that free racial contact, or social equality as Southern patois has it, means contamination of blood and lowering of ability and culture. It need mean nothing of the sort. Abolition of class distinction did not mean universal intermarriage of stocks, but rather the survival of the fittest by peaceful, personal, and social selection. A selection all the more effective because free democracy and equality of opportunity allow the best to rise to their rightful place. The same is true in racial contact. Vertical race distinctions are even more emphatic hindrances to human evolution than horizontal class distinctions, and their tearing away involves fewer chances of degradation and greater opportunities of human betterment than in case of class lines. On the other hand, persistence in racial distinction spells disaster sooner or later. The earth is growing smaller and more accessible. Race contact will become, in the future, increasingly inevitable, not only in America, Asia, and Africa, but even in Europe. The color line will mean not simply a return to the absurdities of class as exhibited in the 16th and 17th centuries, but even to the caste of ancient days. This, however, the Japanese, the Chinese, the East Indians, and the Negroes are going to resent in just such proportion as they gain the power. And they are gaining the power, and they cannot be kept from gaining more power. The price of repression will then be hypocrisy and slavery and blood. This is the situation today. Has John Brown no message, no legacy, then, to the 20th century? He has, and it is this great word: the cost of liberty is less than the price of repression. The price of repressing the world's darker races is shown in a moral retrogression and an economic waste unparalleled since the age of the African slave trade. What would be the cost of liberty? What would be the cost of giving the great stocks of mankind every reasonable help and incentive to self-development? Opening the avenues of opportunity freely, spreading knowledge, suppressing war and cheating, and treating men and women as equals the world over, whenever and wherever they attain equality. It would cost something. It would cost something in pride and prejudice, for eventually many a white man would be blacking black men's boots. But this cost we may ignore. Its greatest cost would be the new problems of racial intercourse and intermarriage which would come to the front. Freedom and equal opportunity in this respect would inevitably bring some intermarriage of whites and yellows and browns and blacks. This might be a good thing, and it might not be. We do not know. Our belief on the matter may be strong and even frantic, but it has no adequate scientific foundation. If such marriages are proven inadvisable, how could they be stopped? Easily. We associate with cats and cows, but we do not fear intermarriage with them, even though they may be given all freedom of development. So, too, intelligent human beings can be trained to breed intelligently without the degradation of such of their fellows as they may not wish to breed with. In the southern United States, on the contrary, it is assumed that unwise marriages can be stopped only by the degradation of the blacks, the classing of all darker women with prostitutes, the loading of a whole race with every badge of public isolation, degradation, and contempt, and by burning offenders at the stake. Is this civilization? No. The civilized method of preventing ill-advised marriage lies in the training of mankind in the ethics of sex and childbearing. We cannot ensure the survival of the best blood by the public murder and degradation of unworthy suitors, but we can substitute a civilized human selection of husbands and wives which shall ensure the survival of the fittest. Not the methods of the jungle, nor even the careless choices of the drawing room, but the thoughtful selection of the schools and laboratory is the ideal of future marriage. This will cost something in ingenuity, self-control, and toleration, but it will cost less than forcible repression. Not only is the cost of repression today large, it is a continually increasing cost. The procuring of coolie labor, the ruling of India, the exploitation of Africa, the problem of the unemployed, and the curbing of the corporations are a tremendous drain on modern society with no near end in sight. The cost is not merely in wealth, but in social progress and spiritual strength, and it tends ever to explosion, murder, and war. All these things but increase the difficulty of beginning a regime of freedom in human growth and development. They raise the cost of liberty. Not only that, but the very explosions, like the Russo-Japanese War, which bring partial freedom, tend, in the complacent current philosophy, to prove the wisdom of repression. Blood will tell, men say. The fit will survive. Step up the tea kettle, and eventually the steam will burst the iron. And therefore, only the steam that bursts is worth the generating. Only organized murder proves the fitness of a people for liberty. This is a fearful and dangerous doctrine. It encourages wrong leadership and perverted ideals at the very time when loftiest and most unselfish striving is called for, as witnessed Japan after her emancipation, or America after the Civil War. Conversely, it leads the shallow and unthinking to brand as demagogue and radical every group leader who in the day of slavery and struggle cries out for freedom. For such reasons it is that the memory of John Brown stands today as a mighty warning to his country. He saw, he felt in his soul, the wrong and danger of that most daring and insolent system of human repression known as American slavery. He knew that in 1700 it would have cost something to overthrow slavery and establish liberty, and that by reason of cowardice and blindness, the cost in 1800 was vastly larger, but still not unpayable. He felt that by 1900 no human hand could pluck the vampire from the body of the land without doing the nation to death. He said, in 1859, now is the accepted time. Now is the day to strike for a free nation. It will cost something, even blood and suffering, but it will not cost as much as waiting. And he was right. Repression bred repression. Serfdom bred slavery, until in 1861 the South was farther from freedom than in 1800. The Edict of 1863 was the first step in emancipation, and its cost in blood and treasure was staggering. But that was not all. It was only a first step. There were other bills to pay, of material reconstruction, social regeneration, mental training, and moral uplift. These the nation started to meet in the 15th Amendment, the Freedmen's Bureau, the Crusade of School Teachers, and the Civil Rights Bill. But the effort was great, and the determination of the South to pay no single cent or deed for past error, save by force, led in the Revolution of 1876 to the triumph of reaction. Reaction meant and means a policy of state, society, and individual whereby no American of Negro blood shall ever come into the full freedom of modern culture. In the carrying out of this program by certain groups and sections, no pains have been spared, no expenditure of money, ingenuity, physical or moral strength. The building of barriers around these black men has been pushed with an energy so desperate and unflagging that it has seriously checked the great outpouring of benevolence and sympathy that greeted the freedmen in 1863. It has come so swathed and gowned in graciousness as to disarm philanthropy and chill enthusiasm. It has used double-tongued argument with deadly effect. Has the Negro advanced? Beware his further strides. Has the Negro retrograded? It is his fate. Why seek to help him? Thus has the spirit of repression gained attention, complacent acquiescence, and even cooperation. To be sure, there still stand staunch souls who cannot yet believe the doctrine of human repression, and who pour out their wealth for Negro training and freedom in the face of the common cry. But the majority of Americans seem to have forgotten the foundation principles of their government and the recklessly destructive effect of the blows meant to bind and tether their fellows. We have come to see a day here in America when one citizen can deprive another of his vote at his discretion, can restrict the education of his neighbor's children as he sees fit, can with impunity load his neighbor with public insult on the king's highway, can deprive him of his property without due process of law, can deny him the right of trial by his peers, or of any trial whatsoever, if he can get a large enough group of men to join him, can refuse to protect or safeguard the integrity of the family of some men whom he dislikes. Finally, can not only close the door of opportunity in commercial and social lines in a fully competent neighbor's face, but can actually count on the national and state governments to help and make effective this discrimination. Such a state of affairs is not simply disgraceful, it is deeply and increasingly dangerous. Not only does the whole nation feel already the loosening of joints which these vicious blows on human liberty have caused, lynching, lawlessness, lying and stealing, bribery, and divorce, but it can look for darker deeds to come. And this is not merely because of the positive harm of this upbuilding of barriers, but above all because within these bursting barriers are men. Human forces which no human hand can hold. It is human force and aspiration and endeavor which are moving there amid the creaking of timbers and the writhing of souls. It is human force that has already done in a generation the work of many centuries. It has saved over $500 million in property, bought and paid for landed estate half the size of all England, and put homes thereon as good and as pure as the homes of any corresponding economic class the world around. It has crowded eager children through a wretched and half-furnished school system, until, from an illiteracy of 70%, 2/3 of the living adults can read and write. These proscribed millions have 50,000 professional men, 200,000 men in trade and transportation, 275,000 artisans and mechanics, 1,250,000 servants, and 2 million farmers working with the nation to earn its daily bread. These farmers raise yearly, on their own and hired farms, over 4 million bales of cotton, 25 million pounds of rice, 10 million bushels of potatoes, 90 million pounds of tobacco, and 100 million bushels of corn, besides that for which they labor on the farms of others. They have given America music, inspired art and literature, made its bread, dug its ditches, fought its battles, and suffered in its misfortunes. The great mass of these men is becoming daily more thoroughly organized, more deeply self-critical, more conscious of its power. Threatened though it has been, naturally, as a proletariat, with degeneration and disease, it is today reducing its death rate and beginning organized rescue of its delinquents and defectives. The mass can still today be called ignorant, poor, and but moderately efficient, but it is daily growing better trained, richer, and more intelligent. And as it grows, it is sensing more and more the vantage ground which it holds as a defender of the right of the freedom of human development for black men in the midst of a center of modern culture. It sees its brothers in yellow, black, and brown held physically at arm's length from civilization, lest they become civilized and less liable to conquest and exploitation. It sees the worldwide effort to build an aristocracy of races and nations on a foundation of darker, half-enslaved, and tributary peoples. It knows that the last great battle of the West is to vindicate the right of any man of any nation, race, or color to share in the world's goods and thoughts and efforts to the extent of his effort and ability. Thus, today, the Negro American faces his destiny and doggedly strives to realize it. He has his tempters and temptations. There are ever those about him whispering, "You are nobody. Why strive to be somebody? The odds are overwhelming against you. Wealth, tradition, learning, and guns. Be reasonable. Accept the dole of charity and the cant of missionaries, and sink contentedly to your place as humble servants and helpers of the white world." If this has not been effective, threats have been used. If you continue to complain, we will withdraw all aid, boycott your labor, cease to help support your schools, and let you die and disappear from the land in ignorance, crime, and disease. Still, the black man has pushed on, has continued to protest, has refused to die out and disappear, and today stands as physically the most virile element in America, intellectually among the most promising, and morally the most tremendous and insistent of the social problems of the New World. Not even the silence of his friends, or of those who ought to be the friends of struggling humanity, has silenced him. Not even the wealth of modern Golconda has induced him to believe that life without liberty is worth living. On the other side, heart-searching is in order. It is not well within this land of ours. Poverty is certainly not growing less. Wealth is being wantonly wasted. Business honesty is far too rare. Family integrity is threatened. Bribery is poisoning our public life. Theft is honeycombing our private business, and voting is largely unintelligent. Not that these evils are unopposed. There are brave men and women striving for social betterment, for the curbing of the vicious power of wealth, for the uplift of women and the downfall of thieves. But their battle is hard, and how much harder because of the race problem, because of the calloused conscience of caste, the peonage of black labor hands, the insulting of black women, and the stealing of black votes. How far are business dishonesty and civic degradation in America the direct result of racial prejudice? Well do I know that many persons defend their treatment of undeveloped peoples on the highest grounds. They say, as Jefferson Davis intimated, that liberty is for the full-grown, not for children. It was during Senator Mason's inquisition after the hanging of John Brown, whereby the Southern leader hoped to entrap the abolitionists. Joshua R. Giddings, keen, impetuous, and fiery, was on the rack. Senator Davis, pale, sallow, and imperturbable, with all the aristocratic poise and dignity built on the unpaid toil of 2 centuries of slaves, said, "Did you, in inculcating by popular lectures the doctrine of a law higher than that of the social compact, make your application exclusively to Negro slaves, or did you also include minors, convicts, and lunatics, who might be restrained of their liberty by the laws of the land?" Mr. Giddings smiled. "Permit me," he said, "with all due deference, to suggest, so that I may understand you, do you intend to inquire whether those lectures would indicate whether your slaves of the slave States had a right, at all times, to their liberty?" "I will put the question in that form, if you like it," answered Davis, and then Giddings flashed: "My lectures in all instances would indicate the right of every human soul in the enjoyment of reason, while he is charged with no crime or offense, to maintain his life, his liberty, the pursuit of his own happiness; that this has reference to the enslaved of all the States, as much as it had reference to our own people while enslaved by the Algerines in Africa." But Mr. Davis suavely pressed his point. "Then the next question is, whether the same right was asserted for minors and apprentices, being men in good reason, yet restrained of their liberty by the laws of the land?" Giddings replied: "I will answer at once that the proposition or comparison is conflicting with the dictates of truth. The minor is, from the law of nature, under the restraints of parental affection, for the purposes of nurture, of education, of preparing him to secure and maintain the very rights to which I refer." This debate is not yet closed. It was not closed by the Civil War. Men still maintain that East Indians and Africans and others ought to be under the restraint and benevolent tutelage of stronger and wiser nations for their own benefit. Well and good. Is the tutelage really benevolent? Then it is training in liberty. Is it training in slavery? Then it is not benevolent. Liberty trains for liberty. Responsibility is the first step in responsibility. Even the restraints imposed in the training of men and children are restraints that will, in the end, make greater freedom possible. Is the benevolent expansion of today of such a character? Is England trying to see how soon and how effectively the Indians can be trained for self-government? Or is she willing to exploit them just so long as they can be cajoled or quieted into submission? Is Germany trying to train her Africans to modern citizenship or to modern work without complaint? Is the South trying to make the Negroes responsible, self-reliant freemen of a republic, or the dumb, driven cattle of a great industrial machine? No sooner is the question put this way than the defenders of modern caste retire behind a more defensible breastwork. They say, yes, we exploit nations for our own advantage purposely, even at times brutally. But only in that way can the high efficiency of the modern industrial process be maintained, and in the long run it benefits the oppressed even more than the oppressor. This doctrine is as widespread as it is false and mischievous. It is true that the bribe of greed will artificially hasten economic development, but it does so at fearful cost, as America itself can testify. We have here a wonderful industrial machine, but a machine quickly rather than carefully built, formed of forcing rather than of growth, involving sinful and unnecessary expense. Better smaller production and more equitable distribution. Better fewer miles of railway and more honor, truth, and liberty. Better fewer millionaires and more contentment. So it is the world over, where force and fraud and graft have extorted rich reward from writhing millions. Moreover, it is historically unprovable that the advance of undeveloped peoples has been helped by wholesale exploitation at the hands of their richer, stronger, and more unscrupulous neighbors. This idea is a legend of the long exploded doctrine of inevitable economic harmonies in all business life. True it is that adversity and difficulties make for character, but the real and inevitable difficulties of life are numerous enough for genuine development without the aid of artificial hindrances. The inherent and natural difficulties of raising a people from ignorant, unmoral slavishness to self-reliant modern manhood are great enough for purposes of character building without the aid of murder, theft, caste, and degradation. Not because of, but in spite of these latter hindrances, has the Negro American pressed forward. This, then, is the truth. The cost of liberty is less than the price of repression, even though that cost be blood. Freedom of development and equality of opportunity is the demand of Darwinism, and this calls for the abolition of hard and fast lines between races, just as it called for the breaking down of barriers between classes. Only in this way can the best in humanity be discovered and conserved, and only thus can mankind live in peace and progress. The present attempt to force all whites above all darker peoples is a sure method of human degeneration. The cost of liberty is thus a decreasing cost, while the cost of repression ever tends to increase to the danger point of war and revolution. Revolution is not a test of capacity. It is always a loss and a lowering of ideals. John Brown taught us that the cheapest price to pay for liberty is its cost today. The building of barriers against the advance of Negro Americans hinders, but in the end cannot altogether stop their progress. The excuse of benevolent tutelage cannot be urged, for that tutelage is not benevolent that does not prepare for free, responsible manhood. Nor can the efficiency of greed as an economic developer be proven. It may hasten development, but it does so at the expense of solidity of structure, smoothness of motion, and real efficiency. Nor does selfish exploitation help the undeveloped. Rather, it hinders and weakens them. It is now full 50 years since this white-haired old man lay weltering in the blood which he spilled for broken and despised humanity. Let the nation which he loved, and the South to which he spoke, reverently listen again today to those words, as prophetic now as then. You had better, all you people of the South, prepare yourselves for a settlement of this question. It must come up for settlement sooner than you are prepared for it, and the sooner you commence that preparation, the better for you. You may dispose of me very easily. I am nearly disposed of now. But this question is still to be settled. This Negro question, I mean. The end of that is not yet. End of section 20. End of John Brown by W.E.B. Du Bois.